I was burying my father when my husband decided it was the perfect time to erase my existence. Freezing rain washed over the manicured sidewalks of McLean, Virginia, soaking through my dark wool coat. I stood paralyzed at the end of my own driveway, staring at the black plastic garbage bags lined up along the wet curb. My entire life was stuffed into cheap plastic and discarded like yard waste. I could see the sleeve of my favorite gray sweater hanging out of a torn bag. A heavy brass deadbolt clicked, echoing through the damp air. The sound sealed the fortress against me. Nathan stood behind the glass sidelight, watching me shiver. A faint, self-satisfied smirk played on his lips. He thought he had broken me. He thought he was evicting a helpless, grieving dependent. He had no idea he had just locked an apex predator outside his gates. If you have ever watched someone you loved turn into a stranger just to please their toxic family, tell me your age in the comments below. Hit that like and subscribe button to welcome to Emily Told Stories. You are going to want to hear exactly how I dismantled his perfect colonial life. 8 hours earlier, the world had felt remarkably different. I stood on the solemn gray hills of Arlington Cemetery watching a mahogany casket descend into the earth. The rain tapped a relentless rhythm against my black umbrella. The smell of wet soil and bruised grass filled the air. My father, Elias, was a quiet man. He spent his life tinkering in a Blue Ridge cabin far removed from the colonial opulence I had married into. His funeral was sparse. Just a handful of old friends stood by my side, paying their respects to a gentle soul. My in-laws, dripping in generational wealth and old money pretense, had deemed the service unworthy of their schedule. Nathan, the man who had vowed to stand by me in sickness and health, claimed he had an urgent quarterly logistics review. He could not spare a single hour to stand in the rain with his grieving wife. I thought I understood his absence. I assumed it was simple selfishness. I did not realize it was a calculated, tactical maneuver. The drive back to McLean was a blur of gray skies and rhythmic windshield wipers. I craved the quiet comfort of my living room. I wanted a warm cup of tea and a moment to process the immense void my father left behind. Instead, when I pulled my modest sedan into the sprawling circular driveway of the estate, the house felt strangely fortified. Valerie, my mother-in-law, stood on the sheltered brick porch. She wore a tailored cashmere cardigan and her signature double-strand pearls, looking as though she were hosting a garden party rather than intercepting a widow. "You can stop the car right there!" Grace Valerie called out. Her voice was smooth, carrying the practiced, melodic cadence of a woman used to directing servants. I stepped out into the downpour. The cold hit my skin, but it was nothing compared to the chill radiating from the porch. Nathan stood shoulder to shoulder with his mother. His hands were buried deep in the pockets of his expensive slacks. He refused to look at me. He focused his gaze on a spot somewhere near the hood of my car. "What is this?" I asked, my voice, barely a whisper against the drumming rain. I pointed to the garbage bag slumping on the wet concrete. "A correction," Valerie answered. She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the brick. "Nathan has a soft heart, and you took advantage of that. We allowed you into this family because we felt sorry for you. A girl from a rusty cabin with a mechanic for a father. But Elias is gone now. The charity ends today. This was never really your home." The words hung in the air, heavy and cruel. I shifted my gaze to my husband. I waited for him to intervene, to tell his mother she was overstepping, to defend the vows we took 4 years ago. I wanted the man I loved to step forward and shield me. Nathan finally met my eyes. His expression was flat, devoid of any warmth or shared history. "Mom is right, Grace," Nathan said, without a single tremor of regret. You do not belong here. You never did. You need to take your things and leave." They stood there, unified in their cruelty, gazing down at me with unvarnished contempt. To them, I was just a quiet, unassuming woman who preferred drab suits and packed her own lunches. Over the years, Valerie had loudly dismissed me to her country club peers as a low-level government human resources clerk. They assumed my employment in a windowless federal building meant I pushed paper, filed grievances, and lacked the spine to defend myself against their towering influence. They looked at my modest sedan and my practical shoes and saw a victim waiting to be crushed. They were wrong. I am a senior federal defense compliance auditor for the Department of Defense. My daily routine involves dissecting billion-dollar corporate structures, freezing assets, and dismantling white-collar syndicates that defraud the United States military. I hunt predators for a living. I read complex financial ledgers the way ordinary people read the morning news. I do not cry when faced with adversity. I calculate. Standing in the rain, watching the water pool around the garbage bags holding my life, I did not scream. I did not beg Nathan to let me inside. The deep grief over my father hardened, crystallizing into a cold, clinical focus. Valerie and Nathan smiled, mistaking my silence for a broken spirit. They thought they were evicting a helpless dependent. They assumed, without my father to anchor me, I would simply drift away into poverty and obscurity. My eyes scanned the perimeter of the estate. I noted the newly installed security cameras near the garage. I saw the fresh scuff marks on the front door frame indicating a recent lock change. My mind shifted from mourning daughter to federal investigator in a fraction of a second. Every detail was a data point. Every cruel word was a piece of evidence. I let the freezing rain wash over my face, masking the sudden terrifying clarity taking shape in my mind. "You want me to leave?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. I did not let a single tremor of fear enter my tone. Nathan scoffed, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Just pack your trash into your little car and go, Grace. Do not make this harder than it has to be." I looked at the bags. I knew what was inside them. They had hastily shoved my meager possessions into the plastic, likely rummaging through my private drawers with careless disdain. They wanted to strip me of my dignity. They wanted me to kneel on the wet pavement and weep over ruined sweaters. Instead, I simply nodded. I turned my back on their arrogant smirks and began walking toward the pile of bags. I did not rush. I maintained a steady, deliberate pace. The silence unnerved them. I could feel Valerie watching me, her smug satisfaction faltering just a fraction at my lack of hysterics. They expected a meltdown. They expected a scene they could mock later over expensive cocktails. I denied them that pleasure. As I reached the first bag, I knelt down, letting the cold water seep into the knees of my trousers. I was not defeated. I was simply gathering my preliminary evidence for the war they had just declared. I picked up a stray photograph that had slipped from a torn bag. It was a picture of my father smiling in front of his cabin. The raindrops smeared the glass frame. I wiped the moisture away with my thumb and slid the picture safely into my coat pocket. Elias Kennedy raised me to observe, to analyze, and to never let a bully dictate my reality. I stood back up facing the colonial mansion one last time. Valerie stood tall, her arms crossed in victory. Nathan had already turned his back, retreating into the warmth of the foyer. They thought the story was over. They thought they had written the final chapter of my presence in their lives. They had no idea. They had just handed me the pen. I took a deep breath of the crisp Virginia air, letting the chill clear my mind. I was ready to play their game. The heavy oak door swung shut. The resounding thud echoed across the brick porch, finalizing my physical eviction. I stood there, shivering in my soaked wool coat, as the smart lock engaged with a sharp electronic chime. They were inside, I was outside. The physical barrier between us was established, but Nathan was not finished. He needed to ensure I left with nothing but the clothes on my back and a shattered ego. A crisp, white envelope slid out from the narrow gap beneath the door. It came to rest on the damp welcome mat, absorbing the cold rainwater. Sign it, Grace. Nathan spoke through the thick wood. His voice was muffled but thick with arrogant entitlement. I stared at the envelope. My hands were numb from the freezing Virginia downpour, but I reached down and picked it up. I broke the seal and unfolded the thick legal paper. The heading was printed in bold black ink. Zero Equity Separation Agreement. My eyes scanned the paragraphs. The rain began to blur the edges of the ink, but I did not need perfect clarity to understand the trap. The document demanded I relinquish all claims to marital assets, the house, the investment portfolios, and any future earnings. It was a crude attempt to sever our financial ties instantaneously. Nathan and his mother had clearly hired a discount attorney to draft this abomination in a hurry. They expected me to panic. They assumed I possessed the financial literacy of a naive child. "You want your winter coats back," Nathan taunted through the frosted glass of the sidelight panel. "I can see you shivering out there. Sign the paper, Grace. Leave the signed copy on the mat. If you do that, I will unlock the door for exactly 10 minutes so you can pack the rest of your cheap clothes. If you refuse, you can freeze." I stood on the porch reading the clauses. As a senior federal defense compliance auditor, I spend my days reviewing intricate government contracts. I hunt for hidden liabilities in 1,000-page defense logistics proposals. This separation agreement was a joke. The legal jargon was sloppy, filled with unenforceable ultimatums and glaring procedural errors. It was an insult to my intelligence. Any competent lawyer would laugh this out of a courtroom. But I did not tear the document to pieces. I did not throw it back at the door. I recognized the incredible value of what Nathan had just handed me. He had just provided written proof of his intent to initiate a financial separation prior to any formal divorce proceedings. This piece of paper was a weapon. I carefully folded the damp document along its original creases and slid it deep into the interior pocket of my coat. I would keep it safe. I would let him believe it was discarded while I prepared to use it as the foundational brick of his legal ruin. A sudden movement caught my eye. Through the narrow glass panel flanking the front door, I noticed a strange flickering light. I stepped closer, peering through the rain-streaked glass. Madison stood in the foyer. My sister-in-law was a woman who lived her entire existence for the validation of strangers on the internet. She was an aspiring lifestyle influencer who curated a flawless, fake reality of wealthy domestic bliss. Madison held her smartphone at arm's length. A portable ring light was clipped to the top of her device, casting an unnatural bright glow onto her pristine features. I watched her perform. She forced her shoulders to slump. She contorted her face into a mask of deep, tragic sorrow. I could not hear her exact words through the heavy oak door, but I could easily read her exaggerated lips. She was recording a story for her followers. She was shaking her head, pointing vaguely toward the front door, and wiping away imaginary tears. "It has been such a dark day for our family," she mouthed for the camera, playing the role of the exhausted victim. "We tried to help her. We really did. But my sister-in-law is having a severe mental breakdown. She just abandoned my brother during a time of intense grief. We are all so devastated by her erratic behavior. Please send prayers." The sheer audacity was breathtaking. While I was burying my father in the cold earth, Madison was monetizing my eviction. She was spinning a false narrative to her affluent audience, framing me as an unstable gold digger who had callously deserted her loving husband. She was actively constructing a digital smear campaign designed to destroy my reputation before I even reached the end of the driveway. My first instinct was to pound my fists against the glass. I wanted to shatter her ring light and demand the truth. But reacting with raw emotion was exactly what they wanted. They craved a hysterical scene. They needed me to scream and pound on the door so Madison could capture the footage and prove her fabricated narrative. I refused to give them the satisfaction. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved my own phone. I bypassed my lock screen and opened the camera application. I did not record a weeping video. I began meticulously documenting the crime scene. I aimed the lens at the black garbage bag slumped on the wet concrete, capturing the exact condition of my discarded belongings. I took a wide shot of the porch, establishing the time and location. Then I stepped right up to the side light. I raised my phone and focused the lens through the glass. Nathan stood in the foyer. He was watching me with a smug, triumphant smirk etched across his face. He thought I was holding my phone up in a desperate plea for attention. He did not realize I was capturing high-resolution evidence. I snapped a clear photograph of his face. I adjusted the angle and captured Madison standing behind him, still holding her ring light, still faking her tears. The flash of my camera illuminated the dark foyer for a fraction of a second. Nathan flinched, his smirk faltering as the bright light hit his eyes. Madison dropped her phone, her carefully rehearsed expression turning into genuine confusion. They stared at me through the glass, suddenly uncertain of their victory. I lowered my phone and secured it in my pocket. I reached into the other side of my coat and pulled out a small, worn object. It was my father's cheap silver watch. The leather strap was frayed, and the metal casing was scratched from years of hard labor in his Blue Ridge cabin. Elias had given it to me right before he passed. It possessed zero monetary value to a family obsessed with designer brands and luxury vehicles. To me, it was an anchor. I strapped the cold silver watch onto my wrist. The steady ticking against my pulse grounded me. It reminded me of who I was and where I came from. I was Elias Kennedy's daughter. I was a woman built on a foundation of unyielding resilience and sharp intellect. I did not need their colonial mansion. I did not need their conditional affection. I turned away from the heavy oak door. I walked down the brick steps and approached the pile of garbage bags. The freezing rain continued to pour, but I no longer felt the cold. I lifted the first heavy bag, hauling it toward the trunk of my practical sedan. The plastic tore slightly, exposing a stack of my forensic accounting textbooks. I tossed it inside. I retrieved the second bag, and the third, methodically loading my entire discarded life into the small vehicle. I did not look back at the house. I did not offer them a final pleading glance. I slammed the trunk shut, wiping the rain from my eyes. I opened the driver door and slid into the cold driver's seat. I inserted the key into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. Through the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the estate. Nathan and Madison were still standing in the foyer, peering through the glass. They looked small. They looked uncertain. They had expected a chaotic, dramatic exit. Instead, I offered them nothing but terrifying, unbroken silence. I shifted the car into drive. The tires gripped the wet pavement as I steered out of the circular driveway. I navigated the winding, tree-lined streets of McLean, leaving the gated community behind. The battle lines were officially drawn. They had chosen to strike me on the darkest day of my life. They had chosen to humiliate me and discard me like trash. They firmly believed they had won the war without suffering a single casualty. I merged onto the interstate, heading toward the glow of the city. The silver watch ticked steadily on my wrist. I drove into the stormy evening, fully prepared to burn their pristine colonial empire to the ground. The rain did not let up as I navigated the slick asphalt of Interstate 66. The glaring headlights of passing semi-trucks reflected off my windshield, creating distorted streaks of white light in the dark. I pulled off at a dilapidated exit miles away from the manicured lawns of McLean. The neon sign of the roadside motel flickered, casting a sickly green hue over the cracked parking lot. I parked my sedan near a rusted dumpster and killed the engine. I carried the heavy plastic garbage bags into room 42. The door groaned on its hinges. I flipped the light switch, illuminating a bleak, sterile space that could not be further from the sweeping mahogany staircases and crystal chandeliers I had left behind. The carpet felt tacky beneath my wet shoes. The sharp odor of industrial bleach fought a losing battle against the lingering scent of stale cigarette smoke. Through the thin pane of the single window, the relentless roar of highway traffic provided a deafening soundtrack to my exile. I dropped the bags onto the faded floral bedspread. The cheap plastic tore wider, spilling my damp clothes onto the mattress. I reached into my coat pocket and placed my phone on the scratched veneer of the nightstand. The screen lit up instantly. Notifications cascaded down the glass in rapid succession. My social media accounts were exploding. Madison had wasted 0 time. The video she recorded in the foyer was now live and spreading rapidly across her influencer networks. I tapped the screen, opening the application. Madison sat in her pristine living room, wearing a soft cashmere sweater and clutching a mug of tea. Her eyes were red-rimmed, carefully manufactured to project profound sorrow. She spoke in a hushed, fragile whisper. She told her thousands of followers how hard her family had tried to support a deeply unstable relative. She never used my name, but the implications were precise and lethal. She claimed I had drained their emotional resources, demanded exorbitant luxury, and finally fled into the night, abandoning my grieving husband. The comment section was a toxic wasteland of affluent Virginia socialites offering their prayers to Madison while demanding my immediate cancellation. They called me a parasite. They called me a gold digger who finally showed her true colors. I watched the likes climb into the tens of thousands. My finger hovered over the screen. A part of me, the human part, wanted to draft a furious response. I wanted to post the picture of the separation agreement and expose their cruelty to the world. But acting on raw emotion is exactly how prey behaves when cornered. I locked the screen, silencing the notifications. I refused to react. I let them believe their psychological warfare was working. Let Madison bask in her digital validation. Her fabricated narrative was a fragile house of cards, and I was already designing the wind to blow it down. I unbuttoned my soaked wool coat, letting it fall onto a plastic chair. The silver watch on my wrist caught the dim light of the bedside lamp. I ran my thumb over the scratched metal casing. The familiar texture transported me far away from the sterile motel room. I was 10 years old again, sitting on the rough wooden floor of my father's cabin, nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The scent of burning pine logs filled the small space. Elias Kennedy sat beside me, hunched over a heavy, bulky computer monitor. He did not teach me how to ride a bike or throw a baseball. He taught me how to read binary code. Elias typed rapidly, his calloused fingers dancing across the keyboard with a grace that defied his rugged exterior. He pointed to the lines of green text cascading down the black screen. "People lie, Gracie," my father murmured, his eyes fixed on the monitor. "They hide their intentions behind smiles and empty promises, but the code never lies. If you know how to read the architecture, you can see every hidden flaw. You can build a fortress, or you can dismantle one. He placed his large, warm hand on my shoulder. He taught me how to construct unhackable encryption protocols before I reached high school. He showed me how to bypass firewalls and trace hidden digital pathways. My father was not just a mechanic tinkering with old engines. He possessed a brilliant tactical mind. He gifted me that analytical resilience. He taught me to detach my emotions from the problem and focus solely on the structural integrity of the target. I brought my focus back to the bleak motel room. Nathan and his mother thought they had discarded a weak dependent. They believed I was shivering in a corner, overwhelmed by my sudden poverty. I needed to ensure they maintained that arrogant complacency. I needed them to feel victorious while I maneuvered into position. I opened my waterproof briefcase and extracted my backup tablet. I powered on the device and connected to the unsecured motel internet. Nathan was a controlling man. During our marriage, he insisted we share a family cloud account linking our search histories and location data under the guise of transparency. I knew he was sitting in his leather office chair right now, monitoring my digital footprint to confirm my devastation. I opened the shared browser. I began typing, carefully curating a trail of breadcrumbs for him to follow. I searched for cheap divorce attorneys in Fairfax County. I opened tabs for pro bono legal aid clinics. I typed queries about personal bankruptcy limits and emergency housing assistance. I spent 20 minutes clicking through articles about surviving financial ruin. I crafted the exact digital profile of a desperate, penniless woman scrambling for scraps. I closed the browser, knowing the search history would instantly sync to his devices. Nathan would see those searches. He would lean back in his chair, swirl his expensive bourbon, and laugh. He would tell Valerie that I was broken. I deployed the red herring flawlessly. They would drop their guard, assuming I lacked the resources to pose any real threat. I closed the tablet and turned my attention back to the ruined garbage bags. I needed to sort my damp professional attire from the casual wear. I pulled out a gray blazer, shaking the wrinkles loose. My phone vibrated against the nightstand. The harsh buzzing shattered the quiet hum of the room. I picked up the device. The caller ID displayed an unknown Washington, D.C. number. It was not Nathan. It was not anyone from the estate. I swiped to accept the call and pressed the speaker to my ear. "Hello?" I answered, keeping my tone neutral. "Am I speaking with Grace Kennedy?" a man's voice asked. The tone was crisp, authoritative, and carried the distinct cadence of high-stakes litigation. "Speaking," I replied. "My name is Arthur Caldwell," the voice stated. "I am the senior managing partner at Caldwell & Sterling. We manage elite estate portfolios in the district. I represent your late father, Elias Kennedy." I gripped the edge of the nightstand. The worn wood bit into my palm. My father lived in a drafty cabin and drove a truck held together by duct tape and sheer will. He did not employ senior managing partners from top-tier Washington law firms. "There must be a mistake, Mr. Caldwell," I said softly. My father was a simple man. He did not have an estate portfolio. Arthur Caldwell did not laugh, but a dry, humored breath escaped his lips. "Mrs. Kennedy, I do not make mistakes. Your father was a client of mine for over 2 decades. The situation regarding his trust is highly sensitive and requires your immediate physical presence. We need to execute the primary directives by tomorrow morning." The hairs on my arms stood up. The mention of a trust sent a ripple of cognitive dissonance through my mind. I looked at the cheap silver watch on my wrist. The man who wore this watch his entire life had harbored a secret vast enough to warrant the attention of a D.C. powerhouse attorney. "Where do you need me to be?" I asked, my analytical mind instantly overriding my confusion. "My office is located in Georgetown," Caldwell instructed. I have secured a private conference room for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I strongly advise you to arrive unaccompanied. The contents of this meeting are strictly confidential. Do you understand? I understand, Mr. Caldwell. I will be there. The line went dead. I lowered the phone. The bleak motel room suddenly felt charged with an electric undercurrent. The crushing weight of my eviction was overshadowed by a looming mystery. My father had left me something. Something significant enough to mandate secrecy and urgent legal intervention. I looked at the black garbage bags piled on the bed. Nathan and Valerie had thrown me out, believing I was a worthless charity case. They had stripped me of my home and attacked my character in the public square. They were currently sleeping soundly in their colonial fortress, reveling in their perceived triumph. I unzipped my damp blazer and hung it over the back of the plastic chair to dry. I needed to look sharp for tomorrow. The game had not even begun. The morning sun cast a sharp, golden glare across the surface of the Potomac River, reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Georgetown law firm. I sat in a high-backed leather chair across from Mr. Caldwell. He was an imposing figure, with sharp features and a tailored navy suit that projected quiet, undeniable authority. My gray blazer was still slightly damp from the rainstorm the night before, but I kept my posture rigid. I did not let my current homelessness diminish my presence in his sprawling mahogany office. Caldwell did not offer platitudes about my father passing. He understood that grief was a private matter. Instead, he reached into his desk drawer and produced a thick manila folder. The document was sealed with red federal security tape, indicating a level of clearance reserved for high-ranking government officials. He slid the dossier across the polished wood, stopping it precisely in front of my hands. "Your father was a very private man," Grace Caldwell began, his voice a low, measured baritone. "He cultivated a quiet existence in the Blue Ridge Mountains because he understood the true cost of visibility. He wanted you to grow up grounded, far away from the corporate vultures that typically circle individuals of his caliber." I frowned, looking down at the red tape. "Elias Kennedy was a mechanic," I replied softly. "He fixed old truck engines and chopped his own firewood." Caldwell offered a faint, respectful smile. "Elias Kennedy was a pioneer in naval logistics software. He engineered the proprietary defense algorithms currently used to coordinate supply chains across the entire United States fleet. His cabin was not a retreat. It was a fortress of solitude. He retained the exclusive patents to his code, refusing to sell them to any defense contractor. He licensed them directly to the federal government." The words hit me with staggering force. My mind reeled backwards, analyzing every childhood memory through this sudden, brilliant new lens. The complex binary code he taught me on a bulky monitor was not a game. It was the foundation of modern military logistics. My father had raised me to understand digital architecture because it was his life work. He lived in a drafty cabin not out of poverty, but out of a profound desire to protect his intellectual property and his daughter from the toxic greed of the world. I reached forward and broke the red security tape. I opened the dossier. The top sheet of premium legal paper outlined the formation of an irrevocable living trust. Caldwell leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Upon his death yesterday, the trust was officially activated," Caldwell explained. "Because it is irrevocable, it bypasses the standard probate courts entirely. The assets are shielded from public litigation. You are the sole uncontested beneficiary, Grace. The current valuation of the proprietary patents and the accumulated licensing revenue is $800 million. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the 9-figure sum printed in stark black ink. $800 million. The colonial estate I had just been evicted from was worth perhaps $4 million on a good day. Nathan and Valerie paraded around Virginia, acting as though they possessed infinite wealth. Their entire old money facade was a fragile house of cards compared to the monumental financial empire my father had quietly built in the woods. There is one final, crucial detail, Caldwell continued, interrupting my racing thoughts. The federal dossier contains the legal transfer documents, but it does not contain the physical access keys to the patent registry. Your father assured me you already possessed the decryption hardware. He said he gave it to you shortly before his passing. I blinked, confused by the statement. My father had given me nothing but a brief smile and a worn silver timepiece. I looked down at my wrist. The cheap, scratched watch ticked steadily against my pulse. I unclasped the leather band and held the metal casing in my palm. My forensic training kicked in. I ran my thumb along the smooth edge of the silver backing, feeling for irregularities. There was a microscopic hairline seam near the winding dial. I pressed the dial inward and twisted it a quarter turn to the left. A tiny hidden latch released. The silver backing popped open. Nestled securely inside the hollowed-out casing was a highly specialized, encrypted micro-USB drive. I stared at the tiny piece of hardware, realizing the staggering genius of my father. He had hidden the keys to a tech empire in plain sight. He entrusted me with his legacy, knowing I possessed the analytical resilience to protect it. I snapped the watch shut and secured it back onto my wrist. I looked up at Caldwell and gave him a single, sharp nod. I had the keys. While I sat in the quiet security of the Georgetown Law Office, a vastly different scene was unfolding 10 miles away. Valerie sat on the sunlit terrace of her exclusive country club, wearing a pristine white tennis outfit and her signature pearls. She was sipping a mimosa, projecting the image of a carefree, affluent widow. Across the wrought iron table sat Derek, her private wealth manager. Derek was a sleazy, opportunistic financial advisor who constantly monitored elite banking networks to identify new, high-net-worth targets. Derek was tapping rapidly on his touchscreen tablet, reviewing Valerie's investment portfolio. Suddenly, a priority alert flashed across his screen. It was an automated escrow verification ping from a federal tracking node. Whenever a trust exceeding $500 million shifts beneficiaries, the primary banking networks issue a silent, localized alert to verify regional liquidity channels. Derek frowned, adjusting his designer glasses. He tapped the notification, opening the secure financial ledger. He scanned the incoming data, and his jaw went slack. Valerie noticed his sudden shift in demeanor. She set her crystal flute down, wiping her mouth with a linen napkin. "Is there a problem with the quarterly dividends, Derek?" she asked, her tone laced with aristocratic impatience. Derek slowly turned the tablet around, sliding it across the table. "Valerie, I am looking at a monumental liquidity event that just triggered in Fairfax County. A new, irrevocable trust was just executed. The primary asset valuation is $800 million. Valerie scoffed, waving her manicured hand. "Why are you showing me this? I do not care about some random tech billionaire moving their money around. Focus on my accounts." "Look at the beneficiary name," Valerie Derek insisted, his voice tight with disbelief. Valerie sighed, leaning forward to inspect the screen. She read the stark black text illuminated on the digital display. Beneficiary, Grace Kennedy. The color drained from her face with terrifying speed. Her porcelain teacup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the stone terrace. The hot tea splashed onto her expensive tennis shoes, but she did not even flinch. She stared at the name, unable to comprehend the impossible reality staring back at her. Grace Kennedy. The quiet, unassuming girl she had mocked. The woman she had just thrown into the freezing rain with her belongings stuffed into cheap plastic garbage bags. "Is this accurate?" Valerie whispered, her voice trembling. Is there another Grace Kennedy in this state? Derek shook his head, pulling the tablet back. The alert cross-referenced the late benefactor, Elias Kennedy. This is real, Valerie. Your daughter-in-law just became one of the wealthiest private individuals on the eastern seaboard. A cold, suffocating terror gripped Valerie's throat. Her entire identity was built on the perception of superiority. She had evicted Grace, assuming she was a helpless dependent. She had treated an $800 million heiress like a stray dog. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. Nathan had slid a zero-equity separation agreement under the door. If Grace signed that document, she would officially sever all marital ties, securing her unimaginable fortune entirely for herself. The family would be left with nothing but their failing logistics firm and their mounting debts. Valerie sprang from her wrought iron chair, abandoning her ruined teacup. She ignored the confused stares of the other wealthy patrons and sprinted down the pristine hallway toward the locker rooms. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she retrieved her phone from her designer handbag. She bypassed her contacts and dialed Nathan direct line. Nathan answered on the second ring, sounding bored. "What is it, Mom?" "I am reviewing the quarterly losses." "We made a profound mistake," Valerie hissed, her voice echoing in the empty locker room. Her old money facade was entirely gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered, predatory greed. "You need to find Grace right now, Nathan." Nathan sighed audibly. "I am not chasing her down. We handled the eviction perfectly. She is gone." "Listen to me, you arrogant fool!" Valerie practically screamed into the receiver. Elias Kennedy was hiding an $800 million trust. Grace is the sole beneficiary. The money was activated this morning. The line went dead silent. The bored sigh vanished instantly from Nathan's end of the call. "We threw an $800 million lottery ticket onto the wet concrete." Valerie continued pacing frantically across the tile floor. "Did she sign the separation agreement, Nathan? Did she leave it on the mat?" "No," Nathan replied, his voice suddenly cracking with panic. "She took the document with her." Valerie closed her eyes, leaning against the cold metal of a locker. The horror of their tactical error was overwhelming. If Grace retained competent legal counsel, she would use that document to finalize a divorce before the trust funds could be considered shared marital property. They had to intercept her. They had to void that separation agreement and reel her back into the colonial mansion before she realized the true extent of her power. "Find her, Nathan," Valerie commanded, her tone shifting into a desperate, unyielding directive. "Track her phone. Check every cheap motel off the interstate. We have to apologize. We have to play the grieving, devastated family. You have to convince her that locking her out was a terrible misunderstanding, fueled by our own sorrow. Bring my daughter-in-law home today." Valerie ended the call, gripping her phone until her knuckles turned white. She was preparing to execute the performance of a lifetime. She thought she was maneuvering to trap a naive, grieving widow. She had no idea the woman she was hunting was already armed, aware, and waiting for them to walk directly into the snare. The harsh fluorescent lights of the roadside diner buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow hue across the sticky Formica table. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth near the back corner, pushing a piece of cold toast across a chipped porcelain plate. The diner smelled of stale grease and burnt coffee. It was a stark contrast to the immaculate mahogany office in Georgetown I had left just an hour prior. I took a sip from a heavy ceramic mug. The coffee was weak and bitter, but the heat grounded me in the present moment. My thumb traced the edge of the cheap silver watch strapped to my wrist. The tiny microdrive hidden inside the metal casing held the keys to an $800 million defense logistics empire. My father had trusted me with a legacy capable of shifting global power dynamics. He knew my analytical mind could handle the burden. What he did not know was that this fortune would also serve as the perfect bait to expose the rot hiding within my own marriage. I did not have to wait long for the predators to track my scent. The piercing squeal of luxury performance brakes shattered the quiet hum of the interstate traffic outside. I shifted my gaze toward the large pane glass window at the front of the diner. A pristine black SUV swerved into the gravel parking lot, kicking up dirt and dirty rainwater. The vehicle lurched to a halt, taking up 2 parking spaces right next to my modest sedan. I recognized the custom chrome grille immediately. It was Nathan. In my profession as a federal compliance auditor, I track behavioral anomalies to uncover corporate fraud. When a defense contractor suddenly changes their invoicing patterns or shifts their logistical routes without warning, it indicates panic. Panic is the byproduct of a compromised secret. Nathan and Valerie had thrown me into the freezing rain just yesterday, confident in their superiority. Their sudden frantic arrival at a dilapidated diner confirmed my hypothesis. Caldwell was right. The automated escrow alert had reached Valerie at her country club. They knew about the trust. The diner bell chimed a sharp, jarring sound as the heavy glass door was shoved open. Valerie stepped inside first. She looked entirely out of place standing on the scuffed linoleum floor. She wore a tailored cashmere coat and her signature double strand of pearls, but her usual flawless composure was fractured. Her breathing was shallow. She scanned the room with wide, frantic eyes until her gaze locked onto my booth in the corner. Nathan followed close behind her. He wore a crisp designer suit, but his tie was loosened and his hair was uncharacteristically disheveled. He gripped a small rectangular velvet box in his right hand. Grace Valerie cried out, her voice piercing the quiet murmur of the few truck drivers eating their breakfast. She rushed across the diner, ignoring the confused stares of the waitstaff. She practically threw herself into the opposite side of my vinyl booth, sliding across the cracked seat. Her hands reached out, grasping for mine across the sticky table. I fought every instinct, demanding I pull away. Instead, I let my hands rest limply on the table, allowing her cold, manicured fingers to cover mine. "Oh, my sweet girl," Valerie gasped, forcing her voice to tremble. "I am so sorry. We are so incredibly sorry." I looked into her eyes. They were shining with unshed moisture. It was a masterful theatrical performance. If I did not spend my days interrogating white-collar criminals who wept upon being caught, I might have believed her. But I saw the micro-expressions, the tightness around her jaw, the rapid, calculating darts of her pupils as she assessed my reaction. She was not looking at a grieving daughter. She was staring at an $800 million asset. Nathan slid into the booth next to his mother. He placed the velvet box on the table, sliding it gently toward my coffee mug. His face was a canvas of manufactured agony. He leaned forward, invading my personal space, attempting to project an aura of protective warmth. "Grace, you have to forgive me," Nathan pleaded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I lost my mind yesterday. Watching you bury Elias, it triggered something broken inside me. I was overwhelmed by the thought of losing you, too. I pushed you away because I was terrified of my own grief. It was a horrific mistake. I drove around all night looking for you. I tracked your phone GPS, just praying you were safe." I kept my face perfectly blank, processing his words through a clinical lens. The gaslighting was textbook. He was attempting to reframe his deliberate cruelty as a tragic manifestation of trauma. He wanted me to believe that locking me out in the cold was an act of profound love. He was using the shared cloud tracking software he forced upon me during our marriage to locate his escaped prey. I looked down at the velvet box resting on the table. Nathan reached out and flipped the lid open. Nestled inside the plush interior rested a heavy brass key attached to a designer leather keychain. I had the locks changed back, Nathan said softly, his eyes pleading for absolution. This is yours. I want you to come home. I want my wife back. The audacity of his offering was staggering. He was handing me the key to my own cage, wrapped in luxury packaging. He expected me to swoon over the gesture, to fall into his arms, weeping with gratitude that my powerful husband had reconsidered my eviction. I needed to secure my position inside their colonial fortress. I needed unfettered access to Nathan Home Office to trace the depth of their financial vulnerabilities. To achieve that, I had to convince them that their psychological manipulation was working flawlessly. I had to become the exact victim they expected to see. I lowered my chin, letting my hair fall forward to obscure the sharp analytical focus in my eyes. I forced my breathing to turn ragged, mimicking the onset of a panic attack. I let my hands tremble beneath Valerie's tight grip. I thought of my father, cold grave on the hillside, allowing a genuine tear to escape and slide down my cheek. You told me I did not belong, I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly on the final syllable. You said the charity was over. Valerie let out a tragic sob, squeezing my fingers tighter. I was cruel, Grace. I was projecting my own petty insecurities onto you. You are the heart of our family. Without Elias, you are so vulnerable, and we should have protected you. Please let us protect you now. Let us take care of your future. The mention of my future was the tell. It was a subtle probe to see if I had discovered the trust. They were terrified I had already met with an estate lawyer. They needed to establish themselves as my financial guardians before I understood my own net worth. I slowly pulled my hands away from Valerie's grasp. I picked up a paper napkin and dabbed at my eyes, playing the role of the exhausted, shattered widow. I looked at Nathan, letting my expression soften into hesitant vulnerability. I do not want to fight anymore, Nathan, I murmured, staring down at the cold toast. I am so tired. I just want to go home. Nathan let out a heavy sigh of relief, running a hand through his hair. His shoulders dropped, losing the rigid tension of a man facing financial ruin. Thank God, he whispered, leaning forward to kiss my forehead. His lips felt like ice against my skin, but I did not flinch. I will make this right, Grace. I swear on my life. Everything is going to change. You have no idea how true that statement is, I thought, allowing a weak, fragile smile to touch my lips. Pack your things, darling, Valerie urged, her tone shifting from tragic remorse to brisk efficiency. We will settle your motel bill. You can follow us back to McLean. We will order your favorite takeout tonight and just focus on healing. I nodded, slowly sliding out of the cracked vinyl booth. I picked up the velvet box holding the brass key and slipped it into my coat pocket. Nathan stood up, offering his hand to guide me toward the door. I bypassed his outstretched fingers, pretending to balance my heavy waterproof briefcase instead. I walked toward the diner exit, pushing the glass door open and stepping back into the crisp morning air. The rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and reflective. As I walked toward my modest sedan, I paused to adjust the collar of my blazer. I glanced back toward the diner window. The harsh fluorescent lights illuminated the interior perfectly. Valerie and Nathan were still standing near the booth. They thought I was out of earshot, out of sight. I watched their reflection in the glass. The tragic sorrow had vanished from their faces entirely. Valerie straightened her posture, smoothing the front of her cashmere coat with undeniable satisfaction. She turned to her son and offered a sharp, triumphant smirk. Nathan returned the expression, his eyes gleaming with predatory victory. They were silently congratulating each other on a flawless manipulation. They firmly believed they had just successfully wrangled a naive, vulnerable billionaire back into their control. They thought they had trapped a sheep. I turned away from the window, unlocking the door to my car. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The cheap silver watch ticked against my wrist, a steady reminder of the digital weaponry resting against my pulse. I put the car in gear and pulled out of the gravel lot, following the black SUV back toward the highway. They wanted to play a game of deception and control. They wanted to use my grief as a tool to extract my father legacy. I watched their taillights glow in the distance, feeling a cold, calculating calm wash over my entire nervous system. They had no idea they had just invited a federal wolf directly into their corporate fortress. The real investigation was about to begin. The heavy wrought iron gates of the McLean estate swung shut behind my modest sedan with a resounding metallic clang. The sound resonated in my chest, echoing the reality of my new situation. I was no longer an exiled widow standing in the freezing rain. I had returned to the colonial mansion, but the sprawling property no longer resembled a home. It felt like a meticulously decorated prison. Valerie waited in the grand foyer. The crystal chandelier above her cast a pristine glow over her tailored silk blouse and her signature pearls. She arranged her features into a mask of deep maternal concern, but her eyes remained sharp and calculating. She reached out and took my damp coat, handing it to a silent housekeeper. "You must be exhausted, Grace," Valerie murmured, her tone dripping with manufactured sympathy. "Grief takes such a terrible toll on the body. We need to prioritize your rest." I kept my gaze lowered, playing the role of the shattered daughter. I let my shoulders slump, adopting a posture of total defeat. "I need to check in with my department director," I whispered, staring at the polished hardwood floor. "I have a backlog of compliance files to review." Valerie stepped closer, invading my personal space. The scent of her expensive floral perfume was overwhelming. "You will do no such thing," she instructed, her voice firm and unyielding. "Work is a distraction you cannot afford right now. I already spoke with Nathan about this. You are going to take a formal leave of absence, at least a month. You need time to heal, surrounded by family who truly cares for your well-being." She was cutting off my daily routine. She wanted to sever my connection to the outside world, keeping me isolated within these walls until they could extract the trust funds. I nodded slowly, offering a weak gesture of compliance. Nathan walked into the foyer holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. He offered a tight, practiced smile. He stopped a few feet away, keeping a safe distance, as if my fabricated grief was contagious. "Your sedan sounded rough on the drive over," Grace Nathan remarked casually. "The engine block is whining and the tires look worn. Hand me the key fob. I will have my private mechanic transport it to the dealership in the morning for a full inspection. You do not need to worry about driving anywhere while you recover." He held out his palm. It was not a gentle offer of assistance. It was a warden confiscating contraband. They were stripping away my mobility, ensuring I could not leave the estate without their explicit permission. I reached into my pocket and placed the plastic fob into his waiting hand. His fingers closed around the keys with triumphant satisfaction. "Thank you, Nathan," I replied, keeping my voice frail and uncertain. I retreated to the guest bedroom, claiming I could not bear to sleep in the master suite so soon after the funeral. Valerie readily agreed, eager to keep me isolated. She locked the guest room door behind me. I sat on the edge of the plush mattress, listening to the sounds of the house settling into the evening. The muffled voices of my in-laws drifted up the grand staircase. They were likely sharing a bottle of expensive wine, celebrating their successful hostage retrieval. I waited in the dark. I counted the hours as the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight and then 1 in the morning. I sat perfectly still, regulating my breathing and suppressing the adrenaline coursing through my veins. When the clock struck 2, I finally moved. I changed out of my formal clothes and slipped into a dark, long-sleeve shirt and dark trousers. I retrieved my forensic tablet from my waterproof briefcase. The device was heavily modified, stripped of all commercial tracking software and loaded with proprietary federal auditing programs. I turned the brass knob of the guest room door. It opened with a faint click. The hallway was pitched in deep shadow, illuminated only by the pale moonlight filtering through the skylight. I navigated the familiar corridors with total silence. I knew every creaking floorboard and every blind spot in the residential security layout. I reached the heavy mahogany doors of Nathan's private home office. He always kept the room strictly off limits, claiming his logistics contracts required profound confidentiality. The door was secured by a digital keypad lock. I pulled a small, sleek device from my pocket and pressed it against the electronic scanner. The bypass tool emitted a low-frequency pulse, scrambling the magnetic tumblers. The lock flashed green. I slipped inside and eased the door shut behind me. The office smelled of rich leather and imported cigars. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, flanked by dual curved monitors. I approached the workstation and booted up the primary terminal. The screen flared to life, demanding a biometric thumbprint and a complex alphanumeric passcode. Nathan spent thousands on commercial cybersecurity, believing it made his corporate secrets impenetrable. He did not realize commercial encryption is mere child's play for a federal defense auditor trained to penetrate international supply chain networks. I connected a specialized decryption cable from my tablet directly into his hard drive port. I bypassed the user interface entirely, dropping into the foundational command terminal. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard, inputting a sequence of override commands I had personally drafted for the Department of Defense. Within 90 seconds, the biometric prompt dissolved. The desktop opened, granting me unrestricted access to the entire server. I did not waste time looking through his personal emails or social calendars. I deployed a targeted forensic algorithm designed to hunt for hidden offshore ledgers and encrypted financial statements. The software combed through his hidden partitions, pulling raw data into structured spreadsheets. I stared at the glowing screen as the true financial health of his company materialized before my eyes. Nathan operated Meridian Defense Logistics, a firm that secured lucrative federal transport contracts. He always boasted about their soaring profit margins at dinner parties. The ledgers on my screen told a terrifyingly different story. The columns were drowning in red ink. The company was staggering under the weight of monumental commercial debt. He had taken out predatory loans from unregulated shadow banks to cover massive operational shortages. The firm was not just struggling. Meridian Defense Logistics was entirely insolvent. I dug deeper, tracing the origin of the operational shortages. I uncovered a hidden folder labeled Compliance Directives. I opened the encrypted files, and my blood ran cold. It was an official notification from the Department of Defense Inspector General. The federal government had flagged Meridian Logistics for severe contract breaches. Nathan had been falsifying supply chain manifests and cutting corners on military transport protocols. The upcoming federal audit was scheduled to commence in less than 3 weeks. The financial penalties for these specific breaches reached into the tens of millions. The impending audit would not just bankrupt him. It would trigger a criminal indictment for defrauding the United States military. I understood the panic. I understood the sudden, frantic drive to retrieve me from the diner, but I still needed the missing link. How did my father fit into this impending disaster? I searched his archived communications, filtering for mentions of Elias Kennedy. A chain of heavily encrypted emails appeared between Nathan and his brother-in-law, Carter. Carter was a ruthless defense lobbyist who wielded immense political influence in Washington. I opened the most recent message, sent just 2 days prior. Carter wrote, "The federal auditors are closing in on the Meridian supply manifests. We are out of time and out of capital. The only way to plug this deficit and appease the compliance board is to secure a proprietary asset so valuable the military overlooks the past discrepancies. You need the Kennedy algorithms. If we acquire Elias source code, we can rebrand it as our own proprietary tech and secure the new naval contract. That advance payment will wipe the shadow debt clean. You must secure proxy control over his estate the moment the old man expires." The depth of the betrayal struck me with physical force. I gripped the edge of the oak desk, grounding myself against the rising tide of fury. They did not simply hate my background. They were actively preying on my family. Nathan married me knowing my father held the most coveted logistical patents in the defense industry. He spent 4 years playing the role of the reluctant, supportive husband while quietly waiting for Elias to die. When my father passed away, they thought they could discard me and quietly absorb the patents through standard marital asset division. When Valerie learned about the irrevocable trust, shielded entirely from probate and marital claims, their entire survival strategy collapsed. They realized they had to trick me into handing over the intellectual property willingly. The emotional heartbreak I felt at the funeral vanished instantly. The pain of my husband discarding me was replaced by the icy, unyielding resolve of a corporate warrior. This was no longer a domestic dispute over a broken marriage. This was a high-stakes corporate war, and they were attempting to steal a federal asset to cover their own treasonous crimes. I initiated a secure file transfer, copying every single ledger, every hidden email, and the impending federal audit notices directly onto my encrypted drive. I was gathering the exact ammunition required to build a flawless legal trap. The file transfer completed with a soft chime. I wiped the digital logs, erasing any trace of my intrusion, and shut down the terminal. I packed my tablet back into my briefcase and slipped out of the office, locking the door securely behind me. I returned to the guest bedroom just as the first pale light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. I stood by the window, looking down at the long, winding driveway. A sleek black town car pulled through the wrought iron gates, breaking the early morning silence. The vehicle stopped near the front porch. The rear door opened, and Carter stepped out. The defense lobbyist wore a sharp-tailored suit and carried a thick metal briefcase. His face was tight with stress, and he moved with frantic, urgent energy. He did not look like a man arriving for a casual family breakfast. He looked like a man preparing to execute a hostile takeover. I watched him approach the front door, feeling the silver watch tick against my wrist. I knew exactly why he was here. The next phase of their extortion was beginning, and I was fully prepared to let them dig their own graves. The morning sun pierced the tall, arched windows of the McLean kitchen, casting long, sharp shadows across the white marble island. I stood near the espresso machine, watching the dark liquid drip into a ceramic cup. I wore a plain beige sweater and gray slacks, maintaining the drab uniform they expected from a grieving, inconsequential widow. The house was quiet, but it was the heavy, tense silence that precedes a storm. I knew they were planning their next move. I had seen the insolvency ledgers in Nathan's office. They were drowning in debt, and they needed my father's proprietary software to survive. Heavy, hurried footsteps echoed against the hardwood floor of the hallway. The rhythm was fast and uneven, lacking the usual arrogant stroll of the men who inhabited this estate. Carter stormed into the kitchen. My brother-in-law wore a dark tailored suit, but the collar of his shirt was slightly wrinkled, and his silk tie sat askew. Carter operated as a defense lobbyist in Washington, navigating the murky back channels of federal contracting. He made his living trading favors, manufacturing leverage, and intimidating political rivals into submission. He was a man who viewed every relationship as a transaction and every vulnerability as an opportunity. Today, he looked like a man running out of time. He did not offer a polite morning greeting. He marched directly toward the marble island and slammed a thick legal file onto the stone surface. The harsh smack of heavy paper hitting the counter echoed through the pristine kitchen. "We need to have a very serious conversation," Grace Carter stated, his voice a low, threatening rumble. He leaned forward, planting both hands on the marble, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. I kept my posture rigid, shrinking back slightly to project fear. I reached for my ceramic cup, letting my fingers tremble just enough to be visible. "What is this, Carter?" I asked, my voice wavering. He flipped the cardboard cover open, revealing a stack of printed emails and bank statements. Carter pointed a manicured finger at the top document. "This is the end of your little charade," Carter sneered. "You spent years playing the innocent, quiet wife. You fooled Valerie and you fooled Nathan. But I dig through opposition research for a living. I know how to find the skeletons people bury. We know exactly what you did before Elias died." I looked down at the documents. My trained eyes scanned the papers, instantly dissecting the information. It was a crude fabrication. The emails were doctored, purporting to show communications between my personal account and a shadow offshore brokerage. The bank statements highlighted phantom deposits tracing back to defense contractors. "You used your low-level human resources clearance at the Department of Defense to access restricted contracting bids," Carter accused, his tone dripping with righteous indignation. "You fed that classified information to Elias, and the two of you traded on those defense stocks. That is insider trading, Grace. That is federal corporate espionage. You built your father's trust fund on stolen government secrets." The sheer absurdity of the accusation almost made me break character. I am a senior compliance auditor. The documents he presented were riddled with amateur mistakes. The routing numbers lacked the proper Swift code formatting, and the digital timestamps on the emails were misaligned. Carter had likely hired a desperate associate to forge the paperwork overnight. It was a paper tiger, designed to terrify a civilian who lacked the financial literacy to spot the inconsistencies. They did not know my true rank. They believed I was a fragile clerk who would crumble at the mere mention of a federal investigation. Before I could formulate my fabricated response, the kitchen door swung open again. Madison walked in, holding her smartphone. She wore expensive athletic wear and a smug, satisfied smirk. She walked over to Carter, standing by his side to form a united front. "It is already getting out," Grace Madison said, tapping her manicured nails against her phone screen. "I just checked the local Washington gossip blogs. Someone submitted an anonymous tip this morning." She turned the screen toward me. A popular political blog displayed a fresh blind item. The headline read, "Federal clerk in prominent Virginia family faces imminent probe for defense stock tampering." They were executing a coordinated psychological squeeze. Carter provided the manufactured legal threat, while Madison delivered the public humiliation. It was a classic extortion tactic. They wanted to induce a state of sheer panic, forcing me to make irrational decisions to save my reputation and my freedom. I let my breath hitch in my throat. I widened my eyes, staring at the fake documents as if they were a death sentence. I reached my left hand up to cover my mouth, a universal gesture of shock. As my hand brushed against my chest, my right index finger double-tapped the crown of the silver watch strapped to my wrist. A faint haptic buzz vibrated against my skin. The encrypted audio recorder built into the modified device was now active and transmitting directly to my secure cloud server. Every word they spoke was now being preserved as pristine federal evidence. "This is a mistake," I stammered, forcing a tear to pool in the corner of my eye. "I never traded any stocks. My father earned his money through his software engineering. You know this is not true. Truth is entirely subjective in Washington, Grace Carter replied, his voice hardening into a cold, ruthless edge. It does not matter if it is real. What matters is that I have a network of friendly journalists and contacts at the Justice Department. If I hand this file over to my network, your quiet little life is finished. You will be fired from your government job before lunch. You will be indicted, arrested, and paraded through the media as a traitor. You will spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Madison nodded in agreement, her eyes gleaming with cruel delight. Think of the disgrace, Grace. Your father's legacy will be ruined. The government will seize the entire trust. You will lose everything. I let a sob escape my lips. I gripped the edge of the marble island, acting as though my knees were giving out under the crushing weight of their threats. Please, I whispered, looking back and forth between them. Please do not do this. I have nothing left but my father memory. What do you want from me? Why are you doing this? Carter stood up straight, adjusting his silk tie with victorious satisfaction. He believed he had broken the horse. He believed the reins were now firmly in his grasp. We do not want to see you destroyed, Grace Carter said, adopting a sickening tone of false magnanimity. Nathan still cares for you, despite your erratic behavior. We are willing to make this entire investigation disappear. We can bury this file and ensure the blogs take down those posts. But you have to prove your loyalty to this family. How? I asked, my voice barely a squeak. Elias left you a portfolio of proprietary software patents, Carter explained, leaning back in his chair. Those logistics algorithms are complicated, and you lack the corporate infrastructure to manage them properly. Nathan Logistics Firm is perfectly positioned to handle the federal licensing. You are going to sign a proxy agreement, transferring total administrative control of those patents into a new holding company managed by Nathan and myself. He was demanding the keys to an $800 million empire in exchange for my freedom. Under Title 18 of the United States Code, threatening a federal official to extract a thing of value constitutes a Class B felony. Carter had just committed federal extortion on a crystal-clear audio recording. He was handing me the exact rope I needed to hang him. I cannot just sign over my father's work, I cried, shaking my head in exaggerated despair. It is all I have. It is too fast. You do not have the luxury of time, Carter snapped, slamming his hand on the marble to emphasize his dominance. The compliance boards move fast. You have until tonight to draft the transfer documents with your estate lawyer. If those patents are not secured in our holding company by dinner, I will make the calls. Madison stepped back, checking her reflection in the dark screen of the oven door. Make the right choice, Grace. We are throwing you a lifeline. Carter picked up his coffee cup and walked out of the kitchen, his heavy footsteps retreating down the hallway. Madison followed closely behind him, already typing a new message on her phone, likely preparing the next phase of her digital smear campaign. I stood alone in the kitchen, listening to their fading footsteps. I reached up and tapped the crown of my silver watch, stopping the recording. The encrypted file uploaded instantly to the secured server. The tears vanished from my eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. They thought they had trapped a helpless civilian in an inescapable corner. They had no idea they had just provided a sworn federal auditor with irrefutable proof of criminal extortion, wire fraud, and conspiracy. I had the audio. I had the motive. I was meticulously building the foundation of their ruin. I took a deep breath, smoothing the front of my beige sweater. The first phase of my tactical surrender was complete. But before I could return to my room to contact Caldwell, the heavy swinging door of the kitchen pushed open again. Valerie stepped into the room. She wore a pristine, white-tailored suit and carried a crisp piece of paper in her manicured hand. The extortion was not over. The psychological terrorism was about to evolve into a direct financial assault, and I needed to prepare for the next wave of their desperate arrogance. Valerie stepped into the kitchen wearing a pristine white tailored suit. She held a crisp piece of paper in her manicured hand. The air in the room grew dense. I anticipated an immediate confrontation, but Valerie simply offered a cold, rigid smile. She informed me that my presence was required at a formal family dinner at 8 o'clock. She stated we needed to settle outstanding accounts before moving forward with any patent transfers. She turned on her heel and departed, leaving the ominous command hanging in the air. 8 o'clock arrived with suffocating tension. The dining room of the McLean estate was a cavernous space designed to intimidate guests. Unlit crystal chandeliers hung above a long, polished mahogany table set with heavy silver cutlery and fine bone china. The atmosphere felt less like a domestic gathering and more like a hostile tribunal. Nathan sat at the head of the table sipping a dark, vintage red wine. Carter and Madison sat adjacent to him, murmuring quiet jokes and ignoring my arrival. Valerie took the seat directly across from me. I wore the same drab beige sweater, maintaining my role as the defeated widow. I stared down at my untouched plate of roasted pheasant. My stomach churned, but it was not from fear. It was from the staggering audacity of the people surrounding me. My mind raced back to the afternoon. After Carter issued his blackmail threat in the kitchen, I had retreated to the locked guest room. I booted up my forensic tablet to verify my personal financial standing. I audited the joint checking account I shared with Nathan since our wedding day. I expected to see our usual modest balance. Instead, I discovered a staggering anomaly. $500,000 had vanished. I traced the digital footprint instantly. A wire transfer had been executed 48 hours prior, routed directly to the McLean Country Club holding accounts. Valerie had utilized her status as a guarantor on the account, a relic from our early marriage, to forge my authorization. She drained the marital funds using the cash to finance an extravagant upcoming charity gala to elevate her fragile social standing. Valerie needed to balance the ledger before federal banking regulators flagged the sudden, exorbitant withdrawal. She needed a cover story to legitimize the theft. Valerie cleared her throat, bringing my focus back to the dining room. She tapped her silver spoon against her crystal goblet. The sharp chime silenced the room. Nathan set his wine glass down. Carter folded his hands, resting them on the mahogany surface. Valerie slid the crisp document across the polished wood. It glided smoothly, stopping right next to my plate. I picked up the heavy paper. It was a formalized, itemized invoice. The total sum printed in bold black ink at the bottom read $500,000. "What is this, Valerie?" I asked, forcing my voice to tremble and my breathing to turn shallow. Valerie offered a smile devoid of any human warmth. "That is the cost of marital support, Grace. We calculated your expenses over the past 4 years. The organic meals prepared by private chefs, the utilities required to heat this sprawling estate, the exclusive country club initiation fees, and the monthly dues levied to maintain your presence in our circles. You contributed nothing of value during this marriage. You existed solely as a financial burden. Now that you have inherited a substantial fortune, I demand immediate reimbursement for the resources you consumed." Nathan leaned forward, pointing a finger at me. "You owe us, Grace. My mother housed you and fed you. If you refuse to pay this debt, we will tie up your irrevocable trust in civil court for a decade. We have judges on our payroll who will freeze your assets indefinitely. You will not see a single dime of Elias Kennedy money until you make us whole." Carter swirled his wine, chiming in with a threatening undertone. "Consider it a down payment on your freedom. Paying this invoice proves your loyalty to the family. It proves you are willing to cooperate with the patent transfer we discussed this morning. If you fail to pay, I will leak the insider trading dossier to the press tomorrow. You will lose your federal career and your freedom. I stared at the invoice. The itemized list was a desperate, sloppy fiction. The groceries, the utilities, the country club fees, none of it mathematically added up to a clean $500,000. It was a precise, panicked number. Valerie engineered this invoice to create a retroactive paper trail. She wanted me to sign a check from the trust to cover the exact amount she had already stolen from the joint account. Valerie intended to label the stolen funds as a voluntary reimbursement, laundering the theft through fabricated domestic expenses. The sheer arrogance was breathtaking. To cross state lines utilizing federal banking networks to conceal embezzled funds constitutes a Class C felony. By handing me this physical invoice, Valerie provided undeniable, documented proof of her intent to commit wire fraud. The paper in my hand was a signed confession wrapped in a bow. I fought a profound urge to laugh. The hilarity of their miscalculation bubbled in my chest. I bit the inside of my cheek, pressing my teeth into the soft tissue until I tasted the faint metallic tang of blood. The physical pain grounded me, helping me maintain the facade of a terrified, cornered victim. I let my hands shake visibly. I dropped the paper onto the table as if it burned my fingers. I looked at Valerie with wide, panicked eyes shrinking back into my chair. "I do not have access to those funds yet," I whispered, letting a single tear spill over my eyelashes. "The estate attorney needs time to execute the transfer. Please give me a few days to figure this out. I swear I will make it right." Valerie leaned back in her chair, victorious. She believed she had crushed my final ounce of resistance. "You have until Friday, Grace. If the funds are not liquidated and transferred to my accounts by the end of the week, we will file the civil suit. Carter will make his phone calls. You will leave this house in handcuffs." I nodded slowly, acting utterly defeated. I reached out with trembling fingers and folded the invoice. I slid the heavy paper into the pocket of my slacks. It rested against my hip, a loaded weapon secured firmly in my arsenal. The dinner concluded in stifling silence. The predators had feasted on my fabricated fear, and they were satisfied. Nathan and Carter excused themselves, retreating to the parlor to discuss corporate strategy. Madison returned to her smartphone, eager to monitor her fabricated online narrative and bask in the digital sympathy of her followers. I returned to the guest bedroom. The moment the lock clicked shut, the performance ended. The trembling ceased. My breathing steadied into a calm, calculated rhythm. I pulled the invoice from my pocket and flattened it on the bedside table. I retrieved my forensic tablet and scanned the document, uploading the high-resolution image directly to my encrypted cloud server. The evidence was now preserved for the inevitable federal indictment. But the $500,000 theft was merely a symptom of a much larger disease. Nathan and Carter were frantic. Valerie was reckless. The holding company Carter demanded I utilize for the patent transfer had to contain deeper secrets. They were pushing too hard and moving too fast. I sat on the edge of the bed, opening my auditing software once again. I needed to understand the exact structure of the Delaware Shell Corporation they wanted to use. I tapped into the corporate registry, bypassing standard paywalls using my government credentials. I initiated a deep dive into the routing numbers associated with Carter Lobbying Firm and Nathan Logistics Company. The hunt continued in the quiet shadows of the colonial estate. I prepared to peel back the next layer of their financial ruin, ready to discover exactly why they were truly drowning. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I sat cross-legged on the guest bed, illuminated only by the sterile glow of my tablet. The $500,000 invoice lay folded on the nightstand, a petty crime compared to the financial labyrinth I was about to enter. Nathan and Carter wanted me to transfer my father's legacy into a specific holding company. They claimed it was a standard administrative vehicle. My instincts, honed by years of hunting federal fraud, screamed otherwise. I opened a secure terminal command window. Standard civilian auditing tools are designed to read visible ledgers. They flag obvious discrepancies. But sophisticated thieves do not leave their stolen capital in plain sight. They bury it beneath layers of corporate obfuscation. To pierce those layers, I needed a weapon built for the dark. I initiated a proprietary Department of Defense tracking program. I spent 3 years writing the core architecture for this specific software. The Pentagon uses my code to unmask international syndicates defrauding the military supply chain. Tonight, I aimed that exact digital artillery at my own husband. I inputted the routing digits I extracted earlier from Nathan's home office. The program surged to life, rendering a cascading web of interconnected financial nodes. The algorithm ignored surface-level banking facades and tunneled directly into the foundational metadata. It cross-referenced Carter political action committees with Nathan logistics contracts. The screen filled with branching red lines. They converged on a single geographic location known for corporate secrecy: Delaware. The state is a notorious haven for anonymous entities. Anyone can register a business there without disclosing the actual beneficial owners. Nathan and Carter had exploited this legal loophole to establish a sprawling network of dummy entities. I watched the algorithm unravel the knotted thread. 7 distinct shell corporations materialized on my screen. They fed into one another, creating a dizzying cycle of phantom transactions designed to confuse standard regulatory investigators. I isolated the primary node. It was an entity named Vanguard Horizon Holdings. This was the exact destination Carter demanded I use for the patent transfer. I commanded the software to strip away the corporate veil and display the origin of the capital flowing through Vanguard Horizon. A progress bar crawled across the screen, parsing thousands of encrypted banking records. When the results populated, my heart slammed against my ribs. The temperature in the guest room seemed to plummet. The incoming capital did not originate from private investors or legitimate logistics contracts. The money was siphoned directly from a federal appropriations account. I pulled the grant allocation codes. My throat tightened as I read the government classification. The funds were explicitly earmarked by the Department of Veterans Affairs. It was a monumental federal grant intended to finance affordable housing initiatives for disabled military personnel returning from overseas deployments. For the past 36 months, Nathan and Carter had systematically drained that specific veteran housing fund. Carter utilized his lobbying influence in Washington to secure the grants under the guise of specialized construction contracts. Nathan then used his logistics firm to generate fabricated invoices for materials that were never purchased and services that were never rendered. They funneled the stolen taxpayer money through the Delaware network, washing it clean before using it to prop up their failing luxury lifestyle. They were stealing millions from wounded veterans to pay for sports cars and country club memberships. The sheer depravity of their scheme was nauseating. But the true horror had not yet revealed itself. I needed to see the guarantor documents. Establishing a holding company receiving federal funds requires a designated individual to assume strict legal liability. Neither Nathan nor Carter would ever risk placing their own names on the firing line for such a staggering fraud. They needed a scapegoat. They needed someone with a pristine background and zero criminal history to shoulder the legal burden if the government ever initiated an audit. I downloaded the foundational incorporation paperwork for Vanguard Horizon. I magnified the scanned signature page on my tablet. There, inscribed in neat black ink, was my name, Grace Kennedy. I stared at the forged signature, My breath hitched. It was a nearly perfect replication of my handwriting. They had practiced it. They had studied the way I crossed my letters and curved my loops. They formally listed me as the primary managing director and sole guarantor of Vanguard Horizon Holdings. The implications hit me with the destructive force of a localized earthquake. They did not merely want to absorb my father's intellectual property. They had proactively framed me for their sprawling criminal enterprise. If the Department of Defense ever audited the veteran housing grants, the federal investigators would follow the digital paper trail straight to my doorstep. The documentation named me as the sole architect of the embezzlement scheme. Nathan and Carter could feign total ignorance, claiming their naive wife and sister-in-law operated the fraud in secret. Stealing federal funds carries a mandatory sentence. Defrauding the military elevates the severity of the crime exponentially. If this scheme was uncovered, I would not just lose my career. I was looking at a minimum of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. I lowered the tablet, resting it on my lap. The silence of the mansion felt different now. It was no longer the quiet of a hostile home. It was the stillness of an active crime scene. Any lingering thread of emotional attachment I held for Nathan snapped in an instant. The man I stood at the altar with was a fiction. He was a smiling sociopath who brought me into his family to serve as a convenient human shield. When my father died, they saw an opportunity to force me to transfer a billion-dollar asset into the exact same holding company, cementing my liability while they reaped the rewards. I felt a cold, dark serenity wash over my mind. The grief over my ruined marriage evaporated. The anxiety over their blackmail evaporated. I was left with a crystal-clear, singular purpose. I reached for my encrypted satellite phone. It was a secure device issued by the government strictly for classified communications. I dialed a direct encrypted line. The call routed through 3 separate relay servers before connecting. Arthur Caldwell answered on the first ring. His voice was sharp, alert, despite the late hour. "Mr. Caldwell?" I spoke. My voice a flat, emotionless monotone. "Grace," he replied. "Is everything secure?" "I have uncovered a critical vulnerability," I stated, keeping my language precise. "The entity they want to use for the patent transfer is highly toxic. It is heavily cross-collateralized with stolen federal capital. They forged my signature as the primary guarantor. They intend to leave me holding the liability for a staggering defense grant embezzlement scheme." A heavy pause lingered on the line. Caldwell was a veteran attorney, accustomed to high-stakes litigation, but the revelation of severe federal treason gave even him pause. "Do you want me to contact the federal authorities right now?" Grace Caldwell asked, his tone shifting into tactical mode. "I can have a task force at that estate before sunrise." "No," I answered firmly. "If we arrest them tonight, they will hire expensive defense attorneys and drag this out in court for a decade. They will claim I forged the documents myself to frame them. We need to lock them into the liability irrevocably. We need them to willingly assume total legal ownership of the toxic holding company on their own volition." I laid out my strategy. I detailed the exact corporate mechanisms required to execute the maneuver. Caldwell listened intently, offering rapid legal adjustments to ensure the trap was watertight. "We will draft a comprehensive indemnification waiver," Caldwell confirmed. "The document will explicitly sever your forged liability and transfer 100% of the corporate risk directly to Nathan and Carter." "But Grace, they will never sign a document that transfers that much toxic debt onto their own shoulders." "They will sign it," I assured him, a cold smile forming on my lips. "Because I am going to bury the indemnification clause beneath a mountain of legalese, granting them total access to my father patents. Their greed is a blinding disease. They are so desperate to steal my inheritance, they will not read the fine print. They will sign their own federal death warrants without a second thought. I need the documents drafted and ready for execution by tomorrow afternoon, I instructed. Make the transfer agreement look incredibly lucrative. Build a golden cage, Caldwell. It will be flawless, Grace Caldwell promised. I ended the call and placed the satellite phone beside the forged invoice. The pieces were moving into position. Carter's blackmail and Valerie extortion attempt were mere pebbles compared to the boulder I was preparing to drop on their heads. I lay back on the guest bed, staring at the ceiling. I was no longer playing defense. I was no longer a victim, trapped in a colonial mansion, trying to appease a family that despised me. I was a federal weapon. I had designed the software that caught them. Now, I was designing the legal guillotine that would end them. Tomorrow, I would step out of this room and deliver the performance of a lifetime. I would give them exactly what they wanted. I would surrender. I would cry and beg for their mercy. I would hand them the keys to a hollow kingdom. I closed my eyes, embracing the impending dawn. The final act of this tragedy was about to begin, and I was ready to watch them enthusiastically destroy themselves. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the guest bedroom floor. I sat in front of the vanity mirror, orchestrating my physical degradation. I needed to look like a woman whose spirit had finally fractured under the crushing weight of systemic extortion. I wiped away my subtle makeup, leaving my skin pale and uneven. I rubbed my eyes until the sclera turned a bloodshot red, mimicking the effects of a sleepless night spent sobbing into a pillow. I pulled my hair back into a messy knot, allowing loose strands to frame my face in a chaotic tangle. I wore the same beige sweater from the morning, letting the fabric hang loosely over my shoulders. I picked up the thick leather folder Arthur Caldwell had couriered to the estate an hour ago. The golden cage was ready. It was time to invite the predators inside. I walked down the sweeping staircase, clutching the folder to my chest like a physical shield. The grand living room of the McLean estate was a testament to colonial opulence. Vaulted ceilings, towering brick fireplaces, and pristine antique furnishings projected an aura of impenetrable wealth. The entire family was already gathered there, summoned by my timid text message requesting a parley. Valerie sat on the velvet sofa, sipping a pale golden wine. She wore a tailored charcoal dress, looking every bit the victorious matriarch presiding over a surrender. Nathan stood near the hearth, swirling amber liquid in a crystal glass. Carter leaned against the grand piano, checking his expensive watch, projecting extreme impatience. Madison lounged in a wingback chair, tapping rapidly on her smartphone, likely drafting another blind item for her gossip network. I stepped into the room and let my shoulders collapse. I forced a jagged, unsteady breath into my lungs. Every eye turned toward me. The predatory anticipation in the room was palpable. They smelled blood in the water. I cannot do this anymore, I whispered, my voice cracking on the final syllable. I walked slowly toward the center mahogany coffee table, avoiding their gazes. I let my hands tremble as I placed the thick leather folder onto the polished wood surface. I looked up at Nathan, allowing a single tear to spill over my lower lash line and track down my cheek. I just want my life back, Nathan. I want my husband back. The fighting is tearing me apart, and I cannot bear the thought of going to federal prison. Please, just make it stop. Nathan straightened his posture, his chest puffing out with unearned pride. He exchanged a knowing smirk with his mother. Valerie set her wine glass on a side table, folding her manicured hands in her lap. She looked at me with clinical detachment, assessing the depth of my supposed despair. You brought this upon yourself, Grace Valerie stated, her tone dripping with condescension. We offered you the protection of this family, and you repaid us with defiance. You forced Carter to utilize his political leverage. You forced me to issue that invoice for your marital debts. We are simply responding to your erratic choices. I know, I sobbed, covering my face with trembling fingers. I was wrong. I was holding on to my father memory too tightly. I see now that his patents are too much for me to handle alone. I need your logistical infrastructure, Nathan. I need your guidance. Carter pushed off the grand piano, taking a deliberate step toward the coffee table. He eyed the leather folder with ravenous hunger. "Have you drafted the proxy agreements, Grace?" he asked, his voice tight with anticipation. "Because my contacts at the compliance board are expecting my call by 5 o'clock. If those algorithms are not secured under our corporate umbrella, my offer of amnesty expires." I reached out and flipped open the leather cover. I revealed a stack of crisp legal documents printed on premium, watermarked paper. "Mr. Caldwell finalized the corporate transfer an hour ago," I explained, wiping my wet cheeks with the back of my hand. "This is not just a proxy agreement, Carter. I am formally signing over total ownership of Vanguard Horizon Holdings. It is the Delaware Shell Corporation containing the entirety of Elias Kennedy's software patents. I am surrendering the company directly to you and Nathan. All I ask in return is that you tear up that $500,000 invoice and destroy the fabricated insider trading dossier." The silence in the grand living room was deafening. The sheer magnitude of my offer paralyzed them. I was handing them a billion-dollar tech empire on a silver platter. I watched the avarice flood their features. Their pupils dilated. Their breathing turned shallow. The illusion of their sophisticated wealth evaporated, exposing the raw, desperate scavengers lurking underneath. Nathan set his crystal glass on the mantel with a loud clack. He walked briskly toward the coffee table, his eyes locked onto the signature lines. "Are you certain Caldwell processed this correctly?" Nathan demanded, his voice cracking with unchecked excitement. "Vanguard Horizon Holdings assumes total ownership of the intellectual property." "Yes," I whispered, keeping my head bowed. "If you sign the primary executive slots on the transfer deed, you both become the sole managing directors. The patents become your exclusive corporate assets. The federal licensing revenue will flow directly into your logistics firm. You will save your company, Nathan." Carter practically sprinted across the Persian rug. He pulled a sleek silver fountain pen from the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He did not ask to review the underlying corporate charter. He did not request a 48-hour period to allow his own legal counsel to examine the indemnification clauses. His political cunning was entirely eclipsed by his blinding greed. The prospect of securing a billion-dollar defense asset erased every ounce of basic legal prudence he possessed. Carter bent over the mahogany table, pressing the nib of his fountain pen against the thick paper. He signed his name with a rapid, flourishing stroke. He handed the pen to Nathan. My husband did not hesitate. Nathan grabbed the silver instrument and scribbled his signature right next to his brother-in-law. They sealed their fate in less than 30 seconds. I stared at the dark blue ink drying on the crisp white paper. Hidden beneath the transfer of ownership was the flawless poison pill Caldwell and I had engineered. They believed they just acquired my father defense algorithms. In reality, they had just legally absorbed the exact holding company containing their own embezzled veteran housing funds, cross-collateralized with $40 million of toxic government penalty debt. They signed the buried indemnification waiver, stripping me of my forged liability, and wrapping the federal noose tightly around their own necks. Valerie stood up from the velvet sofa, her face radiating aristocratic triumph. She walked over to the coffee table and picked up the leather folder, clutching it to her chest like a prized trophy. "You made the right choice today, Grace," she declared, her tone shifting back to melodic condescension. You chose family over selfish ambition. We will tear up the invoice. Carter will dispose of his research. Your record will remain pristine. Thank you, Valerie, I murmured, standing up from my chair on shaky legs. The adrenaline surging through my veins threatened to break my fragile facade. I need some time to decompress from all of this. The funeral, the fighting, it has been too much. I booked a small room at a spa retreat in the mountains. I just need a weekend of silence to clear my head. Nathan was already pulling out his phone, likely preparing to call his creditors to brag about his newly acquired tech empire. Of course, Grace. He dismissed me with a wave of his hand, not even bothering to look up from his screen. Take all the time you need. We have a lot of corporate restructuring to handle here. Anyway, I turned my back on the grand living room. I walked up the sweeping staircase and retrieved a small leather overnight bag I had packed earlier. I descended the stairs for the final time. Madison was taking a selfie near the front door, flashing a bright artificial smile. She stepped aside to let me pass, not uttering a single word of farewell. I reached for the brass handle of the heavy oak door. I stepped out onto the brick porch, breathing in the crisp Virginia air. The freezing rain from yesterday had vanished, leaving a clear, bright sky. I walked down the driveway toward my modest sedan. I placed my bag on the passenger seat and slid behind the steering wheel. I looked back at the sprawling colonial mansion through the rearview mirror. They were inside, celebrating their monumental theft, drinking expensive wine and planning their lavish futures. They had no idea they had just eagerly signed their own federal death warrants. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the wrought iron gates, leaving the graveyard of their hubris behind me. My tactical surrender was flawless. Now it was time to prepare the execution. The tires of my sedan hummed against the asphalt as I merged onto the interstate, heading away from the McLean estate. The sky above Virginia was a brilliant, piercing blue. I drove for 40 minutes, putting sufficient distance between myself and the toxic colonial fortress I once called home. I navigated toward a nondescript, brutalist concrete building nestled in the bustling tech corridor of Northern Virginia. This facility housed the secure satellite office of Arthur Caldwell. I parked in the subterranean garage, taking the private elevator to the top floor. Caldwell waited in a sparse conference room featuring floor-to-ceiling windows and a solid steel desk. He wore a sharp pinstripe suit, radiating the intense, focused energy of a veteran litigator preparing for a highly anticipated trial. I unzipped my overnight bag and pulled out the thick leather folder. I placed the leather folder on the cold steel desk. Caldwell reached forward, opening the cover with calculated precision. His sharp eyes scanned the crisp white paper lingering on the dark blue ink drying on the signature lines. He checked the notarized stamps I had legally secured prior to the family meeting. They signed it. Caldwell stated, his voice a low, gravelly hum of pure satisfaction. Both signatures are pristine. No amendments, no legal hesitation. Greed is a profound anesthetic, I replied, taking a seat opposite the veteran attorney. It numbed their basic survival instincts. They saw a $1 billion prize and forgot to check the floorboards for rot. Caldwell slid the document into a protective clear sleeve, sealing the trap shut. The legal maneuver we orchestrated was known in elite corporate warfare as a poison pill. Nathan and Carter firmly believed Vanguard Horizon Holdings contained the exclusive logistics patents engineered by my late father, Elias. My father spent decades perfecting those algorithms in his quiet Blue Ridge cabin, ensuring they remained secure from corporate vultures. He never would have allowed two greedy thieves to touch his life work. The proprietary software remained safely locked inside an offshore trust, shielded by the microdrive hidden inside his cheap silver watch, currently resting against my wrist. The holding company Nathan and Carter just eagerly acquired was entirely hollow. It contained zero intellectual property. Instead, Caldwell and I had restructured the Shell Corporation to absorb the darkest secrets of their own creation. Vanguard Horizon Holdings now served as the central repository for every single dollar they had embezzled from the Department of Veterans Affairs. We routed the fraudulent housing grants directly into the corporate ledger, but the trap required a fatal wait to ensure they could never surface. I used my specialized clearance at the Department of Defense to officially cross-collateralize the holding company with their impending federal penalties. By claiming total ownership of Vanguard Horizon, Nathan and Carter legally absorbed $40 million in toxic federal penalty debt. The government audit looming over Nathan Logistics firm was no longer a distant threat. It was now a formalized, crippling liability chained directly to their personal assets. They forged my signature on the original guarantor documents, attempting to frame me for their sprawling financial treason. They needed a scapegoat with a pristine federal record to absorb the impact of a military audit. But the transfer deed they signed an hour ago contained a comprehensive indemnification waiver buried deep within the tedious corporate jargon. By signing the dotted lines, Nathan and Carter explicitly severed my forged liability. They formally declared themselves the sole architects of the entity, shifting 100% of the criminal risk onto their own shoulders. I watched Caldwell organize the transfer files. The burden of potential federal prison time vanished from my future. I was no longer a target. I was the executioner. But shielding myself from their crimes was only the first phase of the operation. I needed to ensure my $800 million inheritance remained entirely untouchable. Virginia marital law dictates that assets acquired during a marriage can be subject to equitable division under specific circumstances. Nathan planned to exploit that loophole, believing he could claim a substantial percentage of Elias's trust fund simply by holding the title of husband. I reached into the pocket of my blazer. I pulled out a crumpled, folded piece of paper. The edges were slightly damp, a lingering reminder of the freezing rain from the day of the funeral. I smoothed the wrinkled document flat on the steel desk, pushing it toward Caldwell. The veteran attorney adjusted his glasses, examining the crude legal phrasing. It was the zero equity separation agreement Nathan had slid under the heavy oak door while locking me out on the curb. In his arrogant haste to evict me penniless, he drafted a binding contract demanding I waive all rights to shared marital equity. He intended to strip me of my winter coats and my meager savings. He failed to realize his cruelty was a monumental tactical error. I picked up a pen from the desk. I signed my name at the bottom of the crumpled page executing the agreement. I dated the signature retroactively, matching the exact day of the funeral. Caldwell inspected the executed contract, a rare smile breaking across his stern features. "This is a brilliant maneuver," Grace Caldwell noted, filing the paper alongside the poison pill transfer. "By forcing you to accept a zero equity separation on the day of the funeral, Nathan legally initiated the financial dissolution of your marriage prior to the activation of the irrevocable trust." "Exactly," I confirmed, leaning back in my chair. He drew the boundary line before the inheritance materialized. This separation agreement acts as a stealth divorce decree. It legally proves that our financial partnership terminated prior to my acquisition of the trust funds. He severed our marital equity to protect his own logistics firm from my supposed poverty. In doing so, he built an impenetrable fortress around my $800 million inheritance. He cannot touch a single cent. We sat in the quiet conference room, finalizing the digital filings. The federal and state registries updated in real time, cementing the corporate restructuring into undeniable public record. The trap was no longer a theoretical construct. It was a binding legal reality. The men who sought to destroy my career and drain my family legacy had engineered their own ruin. Carter Political Lobbying Firm and Nathan Defense Logistics Company were now chained to a sinking ship of toxic federal debt. They handed me the exact weapons required to dismantle their lives. For the next 2 weeks, I maintained total silence. I stayed at a secure luxury hotel downtown funded by the initial disbursements from my father trust. I spent my days monitoring the digital shockwaves rippling through their corporate accounts. Nathan and Carter were oblivious to their impending doom. The transfer deed provided them with a false sense of supreme victory. They firmly believed they had stolen a billion-dollar tech empire from a fragile, grieving widow. Their arrogance blinded them to the impending reality of a staggering military audit. I accessed the shared cloud server tracking their social and financial activities. The level of hubris they displayed was breathtaking. Valerie maxed out her exclusive country club credit lines, purchasing vintage champagne and exorbitant floral arrangements. Madison posted relentless online updates, boasting about her family securing a monumental defense contract. They were spending phantom money, preparing to unveil their stolen wealth to the affluent Virginia elite. Valerie sent out engraved invitations to every prominent politician and corporate titan in the state. She planned to host an opulent victory gala at the McLean estate to celebrate the acquisition of the new tech empire. She intended to parade Nathan and Carter in front of high society, cementing their status as masters of the financial universe. They were building a stage for their ultimate triumph. I intended to use that exact same stage for their spectacular public execution. I contacted a premier fashion house in Georgetown. I scheduled private fittings for bespoke evening wear, discarding the drab beige sweaters and plain slacks they forced me to wear during our marriage. I selected a gown that projected pure, terrifying authority. I coordinated with Caldwell, preparing the final phase of the operation. The waiting period required immense discipline. The temptation to confront them prematurely was strong, but my profession demanded patience. A federal compliance auditor knows that the most devastating strikes occur when the target is blinded by their own unearned confidence. I watched the calendar pages turn, ticking down the hours until the night of the gala. They threw my belongings on the wet curb, treating me like disposable refuse. They locked me out in the freezing rain, laughing at my grief. They forged my signature to frame me for stealing from wounded veterans. They did all of this, believing I was too weak to fight back. The time for quiet endurance was over. The poison was actively spreading through their corporate veins, and the antidote did not exist. I packed my new tailored gown and prepared to return to the colonial fortress one final time. The trap was set, the bait was swallowed, and the hunters were about to become the prey. 2 weeks elapsed, serving as a quiet incubation period for their towering hubris. The McLean mansion glowed like a radiant beacon of unearned triumph against the dark Virginia sky. Valet attendants rushed down the circular brick driveway, scrambling to park imported sports cars and stretch sedans. Inside the renovated ballroom, a hired string quartet played sophisticated classical arrangements, providing a refined soundtrack for a room occupied by thieves. Waiters wearing pristine white jackets carried silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and vintage champagne. The political elite mingled with defense contractors, swapping business cards and trading illicit favors under the guise of casual networking. Valerie floated through the crowded room. She wore a beaded silver gown that caught the glow of the crystal chandeliers, projecting the image of a flawless, aristocratic matriarch. She possessed a desperate, lifelong need for high society validation, stemming from her own modest upbringing that she spent decades trying to erase. She spared no expense tonight, funding the decadent floral centerpieces and the premium open bar, using the exact marital funds she drained from my checking account. She believed her theft was securely laundered, hidden beneath the facade of an opulent celebration. Near a towering ice sculpture carved into the shape of a soaring eagle, Madison held her smartphone attached to a glowing ring light. My sister-in-law spun in circles, her sequin dress flashing for her thousands of digital followers. Madison always harbored a deep insecurity, craving the spotlight to compensate for a lack of any genuine talent or ambition. She narrated the evening with breathless enthusiasm, painting a picture of a dynasty entering a golden age of technology. She bragged to her internet audience about her brother securing a historic software acquisition, elevating their family status to the stratosphere of federal contracting. Her superficial commentary provided a sickening backdrop to the evening. She fed her vanity with scrolling comments and floating digital hearts, entirely blind to the impending federal indictments waiting just beyond the horizon. The classical music faded as Carter stepped up to the mahogany podium positioned at the front of the room. He adjusted the microphone, offering a slick, practiced grin to the crowd of senators and corporate executives. He built his career in Washington, lobbying through illicit backroom deals, relying on intimidation rather than actual legal skill. Tonight, he spoke eloquently about innovation, family values, and the heavy responsibility of securing national defense infrastructure. He spun a deceptive web of patriotic dedication, mesmerizing the affluent attendees. Nathan stood beside him, nodding in solemn agreement. My husband stepped forward to take his turn at the microphone. He puffed out his chest, wearing a bespoke tuxedo that masked the cowardly, desperate man underneath. Nathan spent his entire life failing upwards, constantly rescued from his own incompetence by his mother checkbook and his brother-in-law political connections. He raised his crystal flute, proposing a toast to Vanguard Horizon Holdings, the entity they believed held my father proprietary algorithms. Standing in the shadows of the vestibule, I watched their monumental display of arrogance unfold. The dramatic irony hung in the air, forming a tangible, delicious weight in my chest. The elite audience clapped, raising their glasses to salute two visionary entrepreneurs. The guests firmly believed they were witnessing the birth of a billion-dollar tech dynasty. Only I knew the reality. The men standing on that stage, soaking in the adulation, were toasting to their own financial execution. They were celebrating the acquisition of a hollow shell corporation loaded with $40 million of toxic government penalty debt. They were drinking champagne to commemorate their successful framing of a federal auditor oblivious to the fact that the trap had reversed. Every single cheer from the crowd tightened the invisible noose they had eagerly tied around their own necks. I waited until the applause reached its peak volume. Then I signaled the two hired security personnel flanking the entryway. They grasped the brass handles of the heavy double doors and pushed them open. The thick oak swung outward with a resounding, heavy thud that cut cleanly through the joyful chatter. The sudden disruption drew the eyes of every single guest in the ballroom. The string quartet halted mid-note, leaving a staggering, uncomfortable silence in their wake. I stepped across the threshold, leaving the quiet darkness of the night behind me. I did not wear the drab, unassuming beige sweaters they forced upon me during my marriage. I wore a tailored, floor-length, midnight blue gown crafted from heavy Italian silk. The structured shoulders and plunging neckline projected an aura of unyielding authority. A single diamond necklace, purchased using the initial trust disbursements, rested against my collarbone. I slipped my father's cheap silver watch onto my left wrist, a quiet symbol of the immense power hidden in plain sight. I walked into the sea of affluent guests with measured, deliberate steps. I did not look down. I kept my chin elevated, locking my gaze dead ahead. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a wide, clear path down the center of the room. Senators and wealthy defense contractors stepped aside, their expressions morphing from confusion to sheer, undeniable shock. They recognized me as the quiet, discarded wife, but the woman walking toward the podium was a total stranger. I radiated the cold, clinical dominance of a predator inspecting her territory. I saw Carter's slick smile vanish instantly. His hand gripped the edge of the mahogany podium so tightly, his knuckles turned stark white. Nathan dropped his crystal flute. The expensive glass shattered against the polished hardwood floor, spilling vintage champagne over his pristine leather shoes. Valerie recovered first her aristocratic pride overriding her initial shock. She pushed her way through a cluster of wealthy investors, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. The silver beads on her gown rattled as she marched directly into my path, intercepting me before I could reach the front stage. She stopped inches from my face, attempting to use her physical presence to intimidate me into submission. The sweet, melodic hostess voice she used for her country club peers evaporated, replaced by a harsh, venomous hiss. She demanded to know what I was doing interrupting a private, corporate function. She threatened to call the police and have me arrested for trespassing on her property. She called me a pathetic, desperate woman clinging to a family that had rightfully evicted her. She ordered me to turn around and walk out the door before she had her security drag me out by my hair. I did not flinch. I did not step back or offer a defensive explanation. I let her spew her vitriol, watching the panicked realization dance behind her furious eyes. The entire ballroom held its breath, straining to hear the confrontation. I looked Valerie dead in the eye, stripping away her false superiority with a single, unblinking stare. I pitched my voice perfectly, ensuring the crystal-clear acoustics of the ballroom carried my words to every single row of affluent guests. "I am not trespassing, Valerie," I stated, my tone calm, steady, and echoing with devastating finality. "I am just here to collect my trash." The gasp that rippled through the crowd was audible. The local politicians and elite socialites exchanged wide-eyed glances, witnessing the spectacular public shattering of the McLean estate most prominent family. Valerie's jaw slacked, her face turning a sickly shade of pale gray. Her mind scrambled to comprehend the sheer dominance of a woman she thought she broke weeks ago. I did not wait for her to formulate a response. I turned my attention toward the stage where Nathan and Carter stood frozen in terror. I offered them a sharp, knowing smile that promised immense impending suffering. The celebration was officially over. The true reckoning required a smaller, more intimate venue to dissect their crimes piece by piece. I turned on my heel and exited the ballroom, leaving them to drown in the suffocating silence of their ruined gala. Tomorrow morning, the real execution would commence. 9 o'clock the following morning arrived with a biting chill in the Virginia air. The glass walls of Nathan Logistics headquarters, located in the high-tech corridor of Reston, overlooked a sprawling gray highway. The corporate boardroom was a sterile monument to unchecked ego, featuring a vast obsidian table and floor-to-ceiling windows designed to make occupants feel like masters of the universe. When Arthur Caldwell and I stepped through the frosted double doors, the tension inside the room was thick enough to suffocate. Nathan paced the length of the slate floor, his tailored suit jacket discarded over a leather chair. Carter leaned against the presentation screen, tapping his phone with frantic, restless energy. Valerie sat near the center of the table. She had insisted on attending, unwilling to relinquish control over what she believed was the final step in securing their new tech dynasty. She wore a high-collared silk blouse, her signature pearls resting against her throat, projecting a facade of aristocratic impatience. Nathan stopped pacing the moment the heavy doors clicked shut behind us. He did not offer a greeting. He slammed his hands flat against the cold obsidian surface, leaning forward with a dark, furious glare. "Your little stunt at the gala last night was entirely unacceptable," Grace Nathan snapped, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You humiliated my mother in front of our investors. We tolerated your dramatic exit because you signed the transfer deed, but the grace period is over. We require the physical decryption keys for Elias patents right now. Hand over the software drives, and we will let you walk away without filing a defamation suit. I did not flinch. I walked past my husband and took the executive chair at the head of the obsidian table. Caldwell stood silently to my right, placing his worn leather briefcase on the polished stone. He opened the brass latches with a sharp, metallic snap, extracting a thick stack of organized files. I folded my hands, resting them on the dark table. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to squirm under my unblinking gaze. I savored the final seconds of their arrogant delusion. There are no decryption keys, Nathan, I stated, my tone calm and meticulously measured. And there are no patents waiting for you. Carter pushed off the wall, his lobbyist instincts flaring at the scent of deception. He marched toward the table, pointing a manicured finger at Caldwell. We hold the signed corporate transfer deed, he argued, his voice rising. We legally absorbed Vanguard Horizon Holdings yesterday afternoon. We own every single intellectual property asset registered to that shell corporation. Do not try to play legal games with us. Caldwell pulled a copy of the executed transfer deed from his briefcase and slid it across the table. You own the shell corporation, Mr. Carter, the veteran attorney confirmed, his gravelly voice projecting unwavering authority. But you failed to conduct a preliminary asset verification audit. Vanguard Horizon Holdings is entirely hollow. It contains 0 proprietary software. Nathan's face flushed a deep, angry red. He snatched the document, examining the signature lines. What did you do, Grace? He demanded, his breathing turning shallow. What exactly did we just sign? You bought a poison pill, I explained, leaning back in the executive chair. Vanguard Horizon Holdings is not a technology incubator. It is the centralized repository for every single dollar you and Carter siphoned from the Department of Veterans Affairs over the last 36 months. The color instantly drained from Carter's face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent pale. His mouth opened, but his slick political vocabulary failed him. But I am a thorough woman, I continued, ensuring my voice carried to the far corners of the room. I knew mere embezzlement was not enough to guarantee your destruction. I used my clearance to restructure the corporate ledger. Vanguard Horizon is officially cross-collateralized with $40 million in toxic Department of Defense penalty debt. By eagerly signing the transfer deed yesterday, you engaged the indemnification waiver. You formally absolved my forged liability and assumed sole personal ownership of that staggering federal debt. You are bankrupt. Nathan stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of a leather chair. He gripped his chest, struggling to pull oxygen into his lungs. He looked at Carter, desperate for a legal loophole, but the lobbyist was frozen in sheer terror. You cannot do this, Carter stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. You do not have the clearance. You are a low-level human resources clerk. You push paper. We will tell the authorities you engineered the fraud to frame us. I stood up from the executive chair, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. I looked Carter dead in the eye, stripping away the pathetic lie they had comforted themselves with for years. I am a senior compliance auditor for the Department of Defense, I declared, projecting the terrifying weight of the federal government. My security clearance allows me to trace stolen taxpayer capital through international banking networks. I hunt corporate predators for a living. You underestimated me because your arrogance blinded you to reality. I reached to my left wrist and tapped the crown of my smartwatch. The device synced with the boardroom audio system. A pristine, crystal-clear recording filled the sterile space. It was Carter's own voice echoing from the kitchen the previous morning. The audio captured his precise threats, demanding the patents and promising to leak a fabricated insider trading dossier to the press if I refused. The recording ended, leaving a crushing silence in its wake. Under federal law, threatening a government official to extract a thing of value constitutes extortion. I noted, watching Carter's legs begin to shake. You provided me with a flawless audio confession. Valerie slammed her hands on the table, her aristocratic composure shattering into a million jagged pieces. "This is entrapment!" she shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical shrill. "You owe this family. You lived in my house. You ate my food. We supported you." I turned my piercing gaze toward my mother-in-law. I reached into my pocket and retrieved the crisp folded piece of paper she handed me at the dining table. I tossed the formalized invoice onto the obsidian glass. It slid silently, stopping inches from her trembling hands. "You demanded $500,000 in marital support," I reminded her, my tone dripping with icy contempt. "But my audit revealed you already wired that exact sum from my joint checking account to fund your lavish country club gala. You attempted to use this invoice to launder your theft. Moving stolen capital across state lines using banking networks is a severe felony, Valerie. This piece of paper is your signed confession to wire fraud." Valerie let out a strangled gasp, clutching her signature pearls as the illusion of her pristine old money empire turned to dust. She collapsed into her chair, realizing she was destined for a concrete cell rather than a country club luncheon. Nathan gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He looked at me with wild, panicked eyes, his towering ego reduced to pathetic desperation.
"Where are the patents, Grace?"
He pleaded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine.
"You have to give them to me. The logistics firm will sink today without them. I am your husband. I have a legal right to half of that inheritance."
I raised my left hand, displaying the cheap silver timepiece strapped to my wrist. My father was a quiet genius who despised arrogant parasites, I explained, tracing the metallic edge. He placed the algorithms in an irrevocable offshore trust located in Zurich. The unhackable access codes are etched into the microdrive hidden inside this watch. And you have zero legal claim to a single dime. Nathan shook his head violently, refusing to accept his fate. "Virginia law protects marital equity," he shouted, spitting the words in a frantic frenzy. "A judge will grant me 50%. Caldwell stepped forward, pulling a final, crumpled document from his briefcase. He smoothed the wrinkled paper on the table. It was the Zero Equity Separation Agreement. "You drafted this document on the day of Elias's funeral." Mr. Kennedy Caldwell stated, his gravelly voice, delivering the final, fatal blow. "You forced my client to sign away all marital equity while locking her out in the rain. By executing this contract prior to the activation of the irrevocable trust, you legally severed your financial partnership. This document acts as a stealth divorce decree, leaving her $800 million inheritance entirely untouchable. You built the wall that keeps you out." Nathan began to hyperventilate, a harsh wheezing sound escaping his throat. He realized his cruel rush to evict me penniless had systematically stripped him of every legal protection he possessed. He was tethered to $40 million of federal debt, with zero access to the capital required to save his life. Carter buried his face in his hands, his political lobbying career obliterated. Valerie stared blankly at the wall, her pearls offering no comfort against the impending reality of absolute ruin. The corporate boardroom transformed into an execution chamber, and I held the sole key to the door. I checked the face of my father's silver watch. The digital hands aligned perfectly. "The trap is closed," I whispered, breaking the suffocating silence. A faint, rhythmic rumbling echoed from the corridor outside the glass walls. Heavy tactical boots marched in unison, marching across the slate floors of the logistics firm. The final phase of their destruction had officially arrived. The rhythmic thud of heavy tactical boots vibrated through the polished slate floor of the logistics headquarters. The sound echoed down the exterior corridor, growing louder and more uniform with every passing second. Nathan parted his lips to formulate another desperate plea to bargain his way out of the suffocating trap he had blindly walked into. He never secured the chance to speak a single syllable. I lowered my gaze to the pristine face of my father's silver watch resting against my wrist. The delicate metal hands aligned in perfect synchronization. It was exactly 10 in the morning. The grace period had officially expired. The frosted glass double doors of the corporate boardroom burst open with staggering force. The brass handles struck the interior walls with a deafening crack that shattered the tense silence. This was not a visit from local law enforcement seeking a polite conversation. A specialized tactical unit poured into the room, moving with unyielding, synchronized precision. The men and women wore dark tactical windbreakers, bearing the stark, bold lettering of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Defense. They fanned out across the room, instantly securing every exit and cutting off any potential avenue of escape. Bureaucratic investigations typically require months of tedious administrative maneuvering before producing a single subpoena. But when a sworn federal compliance auditor submits a heavily encrypted dossier containing irrefutable proof of stolen veteran grants, the governmental machinery operates with terrifying velocity. My credentials ensured the evidence bypassed the standard red tape. The prosecutors reviewed the forged guarantor documents, the offshore routing numbers, and the audio recording of political extortion. They mobilized the strike team before sunrise. The predators were now surrounded by a force they could not intimidate, manipulate, or bribe. The lead federal agent stepped forward. He possessed a stern, weathered face and eyes that held zero capacity for sympathy. He did not ask for permission to speak. He commanded the space the moment his boots crossed the threshold. He unholstered a thick stack of folded warrants from his jacket pocket, holding them up to the sterile boardroom lighting. Nathan Kennedy and Carter Hayes, the lead agent, announced his voice, a deep, booming baritone that rattled the glass walls. You are hereby placed under immediate federal arrest. We hold specialized warrants charging both of you with severe wire fraud, interstate embezzlement of federal funds, and the direct extortion of a sworn government official. Carter stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the slate floor. The slick political lobbyist who spent his entire career navigating Washington back channels realized his contacts could not save him from a localized, tactical raid. He raised his shaking hands in a gesture of pathetic surrender. He opened his mouth to invoke his right to legal counsel, but his vocal cords seized under the crushing weight of his impending ruin. He knew the audio recording of his blackmail attempt rendered any defense entirely useless. Nathan reacted with unadulterated panic. His towering ego crumbled, leaving behind a terrified, frantic shell. He backed away from the obsidian table, retreating until his shoulders hit the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the highway. He shook his head side to side, his tailored suit crinkling as he hyperventilated. "This is a mistake," Nathan stammered, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "She engineered this entire situation. She tricked us into signing those corporate transfer documents. You need to arrest her. She is the one responsible for the holding company." The lead agent did not even bother to look in my direction. "The signature on the primary incorporation documents was a verified forgery, Mr. Kennedy," the agent replied, his tone dripping with clinical disdain. "We have already authenticated the indemnification waiver you signed yesterday afternoon. You assumed sole personal liability for the stolen military grants. Keep your hands where I can see them." A sudden commotion at the doorway drew the attention of the room. 2 federal agents escorted Madison into the boardroom. My sister-in-law looked utterly disheveled, her usual pristine influencer aesthetic ruined by smeared makeup and wide, terrified eyes. She had traveled to the corporate office to live stream the supposed acquisition of the new tech dynasty. Instead, she found herself intercepted in the lobby by federal authorities. One of the agents held her sparkling designer smartphone enclosed in a clear plastic evidence bag. "Give that back to me," Madison whined, her voice pitching into a hysterical shrill. "I have brand sponsorships tied to that device. You cannot just steal my property without a reason." The agent holding the evidence bag shot her a silencing glare. "Your device is a primary instrument in an ongoing federal cyberstalking and defamation investigation," the agent informed her sharply. The digital footprints tracing the anonymous smears against a federal auditor originated directly from this hardware. "You are a named co-conspirator in this indictment. Sit down and remain silent." Madison collapsed into a leather chair near the doorway, her digital empire evaporating into thin air. Without her smartphone, she was rendered entirely powerless, stripped of the artificial validation she craved her entire life. Nathan watched his sister crumble and realized the depth of their annihilation. He turned his desperate gaze toward the center of the table, where his mother remained seated. Valerie sat rigid, her hands gripping the edge of the obsidian glass. She tried to maintain the posture of an untouchable aristocratic matriarch, but the trembling of her signature pearls betrayed her internal terror. "Call the firm retaining counsel!" Nathan screamed, his voice cracking in a high-pitched plea. "Mom, call the lawyers right now. We need the best defense team in Virginia. Transfer the retainer fees before they freeze the corporate accounts. Please, Mom, you have to fix this." Valerie blinked, shaking off her paralysis. Her survival instinct kicked in, fueled by decades of relying on her vast wealth to erase every inconvenient problem her family encountered. She reached for the designer handbag resting near her feet, her fingers fumbling for her phone. "Do not bother reaching for your device, Mrs. Kennedy," the lead agent commanded, stepping directly into her line of sight. "Your retaining counsel will not be answering your calls today." Valerie froze her hand hovering above her purse. She looked up at the federal agent, summoning a shred of her old money arrogance. "You have no authority over my personal finances," she hissed, her voice tight and venomous. "I am not an executive at this logistics firm. My private wealth is insulated from my son's corporate dealings. I will hire whoever I please." The lead agent offered a cold, humorless smile. He pulled a secondary document from his stack of warrants, dropping it flat onto the obsidian table right in front of her trembling hands. "Your personal wealth is no longer your own," the agent clarified, delivering the ultimate fatal blow to her fragile kingdom. "We traced a fraudulent $500,000 wire transfer originating from a compromised joint checking account. You routed those stolen funds through multiple country club holding accounts to fund a private gala. That constitutes severe interstate wire fraud and money laundering. As of 20 minutes ago, a federal judge authorized the immediate freezing of every single asset registered to your name. Your checking accounts, your investment portfolios, and the deed to your McLean estate are currently seized pending a comprehensive financial investigation. You are penniless, Mrs. Kennedy." Valerie let out a strangled, horrifying gasp. The aristocratic facade shattered, leaving a broken, destitute woman gasping for air. The illusion of her colonial superiority turned to ash. She could not pay for a high-priced defense attorney. She could not pay her country club dues. She could not even afford a gallon of gasoline. She was trapped in the exact same crushing poverty she had ruthlessly mocked me for enduring. The lead agent signaled the tactical squad. "Secure the prisoners," he ordered. 2 broad-shouldered agents moved toward Nathan and Carter. They did not employ gentle tactics. They grabbed the men by their expensive suit jackets, spinning them around with fluid, unyielding force. They pressed my husband and my brother-in-law flat against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The visual was poetry in motion. The men who spent their lives looking down on the world from their high-tech corporate fortress were now pinned against the glass, overlooking the very highway they thought they ruled. The harsh, ratcheting sound of cold steel handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the boardroom. The pristine tailored fabric of their suits bunched awkwardly around their bound wrists, marking the undeniable end of their prestigious careers. They were no longer untouchable titans of industry. They were federal inmates destined for a concrete cell. Caldwell stood silently beside me, observing the flawless execution of the legal guillotine we had constructed. He closed his leather briefcase, fastening the brass latches with a definitive snap. The work here was finished. I pushed my executive chair back and stood up, smoothing the tailored lines of my midnight blue blazer. I walked slowly around the obsidian table, my heels clicking rhythmically against the slate floor. I bypassed Nathan weeping against the glass window. I ignored Carter, hanging his head in utter defeat. I stopped directly beside the leather chair where Valerie sat, paralyzed by her newfound destitution. I leaned down, closing the physical distance between us until I could smell the faint scent of her expensive perfume. She refused to meet my eyes, staring blankly at the federal warrant resting on the table. She looked small, hollow, and entirely defeated. I leaned in closer, my lips hovering just inches from her trembling ear. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a soft, terrifying gentleness that carried the weight of absolute victory. "This was never really your home," I whispered, echoing the exact cruel words she had weaponized against me on the day of my father's funeral. Valerie squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear carving a path through her pristine makeup. I stood up tall, adjusting Elias' silver watch on my wrist. I turned my back on the ruined family and walked out of the glass boardroom, leaving them to face the devastating consequences of their own boundless greed. 6 months drifted past, trading the biting chill of a Virginia winter for the crisp golden hue of early autumn. The dust settled over the high-tech corridor, leaving a stark, altered landscape in its wake. The swift gears of the federal justice system ground the Kennedy dynasty into fine powder. I sat in the polished gallery of the federal courthouse, observing the final sentencing hearing with clinical detachment. Nathan and Carter stood before the stern district judge, looking entirely foreign. The bespoke Italian suits they once wore like armor were replaced by ill-fitting beige institution uniforms. Because the government seized their stolen assets, they could not afford the elite legal defense teams they once boasted about. They were represented by overworked public defenders who looked exhausted and entirely uninterested in their clients' arrogant excuses. The federal judge glared down from the elevated mahogany bench, reading the sentencing guidelines with audible disgust. He noted their profound lack of remorse and their brazen willingness to steal from disabled veterans. The gavel strike echoed like a gunshot. 20 years for wire fraud. 15 years for interstate embezzlement. The sentences were set to run consecutively. Nathan wept, wiping his nose on the rough fabric of his sleeve. Carter kept his head bowed, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor. The marshals escorted them away, their wrists bound in heavy steel chains. They were erased from the corporate world, destined to spend the next 2 decades in a sterile, concrete penitentiary. The collateral damage extended far beyond the courtroom walls. Madison lost her digital empire the moment the tactical agents confiscated her smartphone. The federal cyberstalking indictment stripped her of her lucrative brand deals and her thousands of artificial followers. Shunning the disgraced influencer, the elite social circles she worshipped closed their doors. I heard through the local grapevine that she found employment at a discount retail outlet in a rundown strip mall far from her usual haunts. She spent her days folding discounted sweaters and taking inventory under flickering fluorescent lights, wearing a generic polyester uniform. A former country club acquaintance reportedly walked into the store, forcing Madison to process a return for a pair of cheap shoes. She was rendered invisible to the affluent society that once fueled her towering vanity, experiencing the ultimate degradation for a woman obsessed with status. But the truest measure of poetic justice occurred 3 weeks prior to the sentencing. The federal government officially seized the McLean estate to liquidate the property and recover a fraction of the toxic penalty debt Nathan eagerly signed for. The authorities granted Valerie and Madison a narrow 2-hour window to vacate the premises and collect their permitted personal effects. I drove my modest sedan up the familiar circular brick driveway, parking near the Grand Colonial entrance. A gray, overcast sky threatened rain, perfectly mirroring the day of my father's funeral. 2 federal marshals stood on the porch overseeing the extraction process. Valerie emerged from the heavy oak doors, struggling to carry her designer luggage. Her signature pearls were gone, confiscated during the initial asset freeze, leaving her neck looking raw and bare. She wore a plain dark coat, her aristocratic posture broken by the crushing weight of her newfound poverty. I opened the trunk of my car and retrieved a box of heavy-duty black plastic trash bags. I walked up the stone steps, handing the box directly to the supervising marshal. I presented the official court order, granting me oversight of the asset removal process, ensuring they did not smuggle out any frozen valuables. The marshal instructed Valerie and Madison to empty their expensive leather suitcases. He informed them they could only transport their clothing in the provided disposable receptacles to prevent the theft of seized luggage. Valerie looked at the cheap plastic bags, her hands trembling. She looked up, meeting my unblinking gaze. The memory of the day she evicted me flashed behind her tired eyes. She realized the visual symmetry of the moment. I stood on the porch, watching her carefully fold her remaining silk blouses and cashmere sweaters into the dark plastic. The cheap material snagged and stretched under the weight of her remaining wardrobe. She dragged the bulging bags down the steps, placing them in a neat row along the wet concrete curb. Damp autumn leaves stuck to the bottom of the black plastic. I did not utter a single word of mockery. I did not need to. The deafening silence provided all the retribution required. She hoisted a black bag over her shoulder, shuffling down the street toward the public transit stop. A destitute woman, walking away from a stolen kingdom. I left the seized estate behind, redirecting my focus toward building a genuine legacy. The irrevocable trust established by my father held $800 million in clean, untainted capital. I utilized a substantial portion of those funds to establish the Elias Kennedy Philanthropic Foundation. I purchased a sleek, secure building in the heart of the downtown legal district, transforming it into a state-of-the-art command center. The foundation provides elite, comprehensive legal aid and forensic accounting services exclusively for widows and vulnerable individuals facing probate fraud. I hired a team of veteran litigators led by Arthur Caldwell alongside top-tier financial investigators. We hunt the predatory relatives who attempt to forge wills, hide marital assets, or weaponize the legal system to steal inheritances. We become the nightmare those greedy individuals never see coming. Every time a corrupt brother-in-law or an entitled mother-in-law tries to lock a grieving spouse out of their own home, my team intervenes. We freeze their accounts, unravel their shell corporations, and dismantle their lives with the exact same ruthless precision I used against my former family. We balance the scales of justice, ensuring no one else endures the profound betrayal I survived. The grueling work requires a sanctuary for recuperation. I purchased a sprawling historic property nestled deep in the rolling hills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The estate sits on 100 acres of pristine, untouched forest, honoring the quiet rural roots my father cherished. The perimeter is monitored by advanced security systems, providing an impenetrable fortress of solitude away from the noise of the city. I stood on the expansive cedar balcony overlooking the vibrant autumn foliage. The morning mist clung to the valley floor, burning off slowly under the rising sun. The air smelled of pine and fresh earth, a profound departure from the sterile, polished halls of the McLean mansion. I wore a comfortable wool sweater and sturdy denim, relishing the simple, practical fabrics. The silver watch rested against my left wrist, its quiet ticking serving as a steady rhythm for my new life. I held a steaming mug of black coffee, letting the warmth seep into my palms. The journey from a discarded wife standing in the freezing rain to the architect of a formidable legal empire tested the limits of my endurance. It taught me that shrinking yourself to appease the fragile egos of toxic individuals only invites exploitation. Predators interpret silence as weakness. They view polite compliance as an invitation to steal. True empowerment requires stripping away the artificial expectations forced upon you by arrogant people. It demands building an ironclad perimeter around your self-worth and defending it without hesitation. I did not survive their ambush by screaming or begging for mercy. I survived by embracing my intrinsic power, outsmarting their greed, and letting their towering hubris engineer their own demise. I took a slow sip of the dark coffee, savoring the rich, bitter taste. The vast mountain range stretched out before me, offering limitless horizons and untroubled silence. The war was officially over. The architects of my suffering were locked inside concrete cells, stripped of their names and their unearned prestige. I remained standing in the crisp mountain air, whole, unbroken, and perfectly content in the unshakable peace I forged from the ashes of their arrogance. The enduring image of black plastic garbage bags sitting on a wet Virginia curb serves as far more than a symbol of a ruined marriage. It is a striking visual representation of a generational failure. When we look at the quiet, unyielding resilience of Grace Kennedy and contrast it with the frantic, hollow greed of Nathan and Valerie, we are not merely watching a corporate thriller unfold. We are bearing witness to the profound, inevitable consequences of the values we instill in our children. The story we have just traversed is a stark mirror reflecting the deepest responsibilities of parenthood, the true meaning of family, and the legacy we leave behind in modern American culture. Behind the manicured lawns of McLean and the quiet isolation of the Blue Ridge Mountains lies a fundamental question. What does it actually mean to raise a child? In traditional American culture, we often romanticize the idea of the family as an impenetrable fortress, a place where children are nurtured, protected, and prepared for the world. But the foundation of that fortress dictates whether it will stand the test of time or collapse under the weight of its own rot. Consider the stark contrast between the two parental figures in our narrative. Elias Kennedy raised his daughter in a humble cabin, far removed from the intoxicating allure of country club prestige. He did not hand Grace a trust fund to smooth out the rough edges of her youth. Instead, he handed her the tools to build unhackable code, a brilliant metaphor for the moral compass he instilled within her. Elias prioritized honesty, fairness, and the quiet dignity of hard work. He taught her that true power does not roar from a podium. It observes, it calculates, and it remains steadfast in the face of adversity. He cultivated her emotional awareness, allowing her to process grief without surrendering her intellect. On the opposite end of the spectrum sits Valerie. She raised Nathan and Madison, enveloped in the illusion of old money colonial opulence. Valerie believed that a prestigious zip code, designer pearls, and a curated social image were adequate substitutes for character. Instead of teaching her children the value of honest labor, she taught them that their last name was a shield against accountability. She nurtured a toxic entitlement, starving them of the emotional intelligence required to navigate genuine human connection. When Nathan forged signatures and embezzled funds meant for vulnerable veterans, it was not a sudden pivot into criminality. It was the inevitable, tragic destination of a boy who was never taught the word no, raised by a mother who swept his every failure under a very expensive rug. We are often conditioned to believe that the ultimate measure of parental success is the level of insulation we provide our offspring. We scramble to remove obstacles, working tirelessly to ensure they never feel the raw sting of failure, the humiliation of a misstep, or the heavy burden of consequence. Society whispers that a good parent paves a smooth golden road for their child to walk upon. Yet looking at the spectacular ruin of the Kennedy dynasty, a different, far more sobering truth emerges. Protecting a child from consequence does not keep them safe. It makes them profound liabilities. When we shield our children from the natural repercussions of their actions, we do not build confidence. We breed fragility disguised as arrogance. Nathan and Madison were fundamentally hollow adults because their foundation was constructed on a lifetime of unearned rescues. When the true weight of the real world finally crashed down upon them in the form of federal indictments and insurmountable debt, they possessed zero internal resilience. They shattered upon impact because their mother had spent decades softening every blow. True family responsibility requires the courage to let our children fall. It requires the emotional fortitude to stand back and watch them navigate the difficult, agonizing terrain of their own mistakes. A parent's love should not be a soft pillow. It must be a whetstone. We sharpen our children by holding them accountable, by demanding fairness, and by insisting that empathy and honesty are non-negotiable requirements for living in a civilized society. The American dream is frequently intertwined with the pursuit of upward mobility. Yet this narrative reminds us that financial inheritance is meaningless without a corresponding inheritance of character. Grace possessed an $800 million trust, but her true wealth was her emotional regulation. When faced with ultimate betrayal, she did not dissolve into hysterical vengeance. She utilized the quiet, analytical strength her father nurtured within her. She understood that reacting to a narcissist only feeds their endless hunger for drama. Her strategic silence was the direct product of a childhood rooted in stability and emotional truth. Conversely, Valerie's children were emotionally stunted, driven only by the frantic pursuit of external validation. They equated net worth with human worth. When parents prioritize appearances over authenticity, they raise predators who will eventually turn their voracious appetites inward, consuming the very family structure that created them. Stories like this one hold a mirror to our own lives, urging us to examine the invisible lessons we are passing down to the next generation. We must ask ourselves if we are raising builders who will leave the world better than they found it, or scavengers who will exploit the vulnerable for a fleeting taste of power. If this journey through the shadows of family dynamics, resilience, and quiet retribution resonates with you, and if you seek more narratives that explore the complex depths of the human experience, I invite you to follow Emily Told Stories. Together, we will continue to uncover the profound truths hidden beneath the surface of our everyday lives. The final reflection. As we close the book on Grace Nathan and the ashes of the McLean estate, we are left with a lingering, unsettling thought. We spend our lives terrified of the dangers lurking outside our front doors. We install heavy oak doors and sophisticated smart locks to keep the monsters at bay. But the most profound danger to a family does not arrive like a thief in the night. It is carefully nurtured at the dining room table. We are taught that our ultimate duty is to leave a better world for our children. Perhaps this is the wrong paradigm entirely. The true agonizing responsibility of adulthood is not to leave a better world for our children, but to leave better children for our world. If we fail in this, all the wealth, all the prestigious titles, and all the colonial mansions in existence are nothing more than beautifully decorated tombs waiting to bury the very legacies we fought so hard to protect. Look closely at the faces across your own dinner table tonight. Are you sharpening a sword, or are you simply polishing a stone that will one day drag them straight to the bottom?